They say an alpha can survive a blade to the chest. They're right. What kills him slower, what hollows him out from the inside like rot taking a oak, is watching the woman he built his throne beside become a stranger in her own palace. This is not a story about a king who lost his crown. This is a story about a queen who found hers. If you've ever loved someone who stopped choosing you, stay until the end. Like this video, drop a comment with your city, because this story belongs to every soul who ever had to rebuild themselves from the wreckage of someone else's pride. Let's begin. The war banners of Solmora had not moved in 3 years. They hung from iron rods above the eastern gate, gold thread bleeding into black silk, the twin wolves of House Thorn, stitched with the kind of permanence that empires bury their dead beneath. The wolves faced opposite directions, one toward the frontier where blood had been spilled to draw new borders, one toward the interior where politics required a different kind of violence. Alaric Thorn had chosen that design himself. He told Seraphine, the night the war ended and he pressed his forehead against hers in exhaustion, that a king must watch every direction at once, or he watches nothing at all. She had believed him then. She was less certain now. The morning light came into the queen's private chamber at an angle that had always irritated her. Sharp, interrogating, finding every surface that needed polish. Seraphine sat before the long mirror in a chair she'd never asked to be cushioned because cushions softened a spine over time, and she had learned early that comfort was a debt paid in discipline. Her handmaid, a girl named Prissa, who'd been with her 8 years and knew better than to speak before noon without cause, worked in silence at her hair, braiding and pulling and pinning, the kind of methodical attention that kept queens from unraveling in public. The morning council begins in an hour, Prissa said. Not a reminder, an offering. She left it in the air for Seraphine to take or ignore. I know, Seraphine studied her own face, not with vanity, with the clinical attention of a general reviewing terrain. There were lines now beneath her eyes that hadn't existed 2 winters ago. Not age. Vigilance. There was a difference, though most people, most men, filed both under the same careless category. The hollows in her cheeks had deepened slightly since autumn. She'd been eating less, not from grief, but because hunger sharpened her in ways that full tables dulled. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had been paying attention. That was the part that frightened her. Lady Veressa arrived from the southern house 3 nights ago, Prissa said carefully. She's been given the amber guest chambers, the ones overlooking the central garden. The amber chambers. The ones with the private corridor access to the king's study. Seraphine didn't blink, didn't tighten. She had trained herself out of the visible reactions, the small betrayals of jaw and brow and shoulder that turned queens into spectacle. She let the information settle into her chest the way cold water settles, spreading outward, finding the lowest places. She's been given a lot lately, Seraphine said. Prissa's hands went still for exactly 1 second. Then she resumed braiding. That second was a conversation between 2 women who understood each other without requiring the mess of language. The council chamber of Solmora was built to intimidate, which was its most honest quality. Black granite walls. A table long enough that a man at one end had to raise his voice to be heard at the other. Maps pinned and layered until the table breathed strategy. Alaric sat at the head of it, the way he sat at the head of everything, with the kind of stillness that had less to do with calm and more to do with controlled force. He was a large man, not decoratively large, not the kind of large that gets commemorated in paintings and forgotten. His was the functional size of a man who had dragged himself through 12-hour battles and kept standing when men half his age had already folded. His hands, resting on either side of a military report, were scarred at the knuckles and along the left thumb where a sword had found purchase 17 years ago. He'd never had it properly treated. Seraphine suspected it was the kind of wound he kept as a reference point, a reminder of what real pain felt like. So the smaller injuries didn't trick him into softness. She had loved those hands once, with a ferocity that embarrassed her memory of it. She entered the council room from the east door, her footsteps even, her chin at the angle that communicated arrival rather than entrance. Alaric looked up. Something moved across his face. Recognition, warmth, and beneath both of those, something guarded that had not always been there. It was like watching a familiar door that now had a lock on the inside. Seraphine. He used her name the way he used the names of trusted generals. Acknowledged. Efficient. No music in it. 3 years ago, he had said her name the way a man says the word water when he is drowning. She took her chair to his left. The ministers arranged around the table did what ministers do in the presence of royalty, performed diligence, shuffling pages, reviewing figures they'd reviewed before she entered. Lord Brennan of the Treasury nodded to her with the particular respect of a man who understood she was responsible for half the fiscal reforms that kept his department from collapse. General Havitt, who commanded the northern border forces and had white scar tissue along his jaw from an arrow that had nearly taken his tongue, met her eyes with something she could only describe as the acknowledgement of a fellow veteran. They'd worked together during the Eastern Corridor crisis. They understood each other. She settled and surveyed the room. Veressa Dune was present. She stood along the eastern wall among the attendants and secondary advisors, positioned, not accidentally, at the edge of the king's sight line. She was dressed in the deep green of a southern house, which was smart because it made her distinctive among the Solmoran blacks and golds. Her hair was dark and simply dressed. Her posture had the relaxed confidence of a woman who has decided that this room already belongs to her and is simply waiting for the administrative formality to catch up. She was beautiful. Seraphine had never been foolish enough to pretend otherwise. There was a specific kind of beautiful that Lady Veressa Dune possessed. Not the soft and gentle sort that courts hung portraits of, but the operational kind. Sharp eyes, quick smile, a face that learned quickly which expression the person in front of her needed to see. Seraphine had catalogued this within 12 minutes of their first meeting, the way she catalogued everything that could either protect her or destroy her. What frightened her was not Veressa's beauty. It was her intelligence. A beautiful fool is a hazard. A beautiful mind is a siege weapon. The council began. Trade deficit in the western grain provinces. Seraphine had written a 12-page analysis on this 6 weeks ago. She had presented her conclusions to Alaric. He had reviewed it, thanked her, and the ministers were now discussing the same problem as if arriving at the conclusions freshly. She said nothing. She had learned that a queen who says "I told you so" is a queen who has stopped thinking strategically and started thinking emotionally. The goal was not credit. The goal was the grain routes. She spoke when Lord Brennan opened the floor to alternative revenue structures. Her words were precise and few. 2 sentences. The room listened. Alaric nodded. Then Veressa spoke. "If I may," she said from the wall. Her voice was pitched correctly, deferential in form, but not in content. "The eastern trade houses in my father's territory have offered a preliminary arrangement that could supplement the grain revenue without requiring internal restructuring. I've discussed the framework with His Majesty." The words landed in Seraphine's chest before her mind had fully processed them. "I've discussed the framework with His Majesty. Not I have a proposal for the Council's consideration. Not I would like to present something for review. I've discussed. With His Majesty. Already. Before this room." Seraphine looked at Alaric. He was looking at Veressa with the expression of a man confirming something he already believed. "The arrangement has merit," he said. "I'd like it tabled for deeper review." Lord Brennan was already writing. General Havitt's pen had stopped moving. He glanced towards Seraphine for 1/2 second, then quickly away. A small mercy. She had not required it. She folded her hands on the table and kept her face exactly as it had been. The architecture of silence required constant maintenance. After the council, she walked the east corridor to the window that overlooked the training yard. She went there when she needed to think without anyone interpreting her thinking as a signal. A queen standing at a window was merely a queen standing at a window. A queen pacing her chambers was a queen in crisis. The distinction mattered because in a palace, the image was half the reality. She watched the younger soldiers drill below. Paired combat, weighted practice swords, a trainer she didn't recognize shouting corrections with the particular frustration of a man who has already said the same thing 12 times today. 2 of the soldiers were wiry and moved with the economy of men who had grown up poor and therefore learned to waste nothing, not energy, not motion, not advantage. Seraphine had always trusted poor men in a fight over wealthy ones. The wealthy ones had the luxury of surrendering. She heard footsteps behind her. Not soft enough to belong to Prissa, not heavy enough to belong to Alaric. "Queen Seraphine," Veressa's voice. Careful, warm without being intimate. "I didn't know you favored this corridor." Seraphine did not turn immediately. She counted to 2. Not from drama, but because turning immediately would tell Veressa that her arrival demanded reaction. Then she turned. Lady Veressa. She gave her the formal address and nothing more. The amber chamber suiting you? A small flicker in Veressa's eyes. Acknowledgement. She'd expected the comment. She was quick. They're beautiful. Lord Selden has been a gracious host. Lord Selden follows the king's instruction. Seraphine said it without edge. Edge would be an invitation to parry. As do most people who understand which direction the wind is blowing. Veressa studied her for a moment, the way a chess player studies the board after an unexpected move. Then she smiled, and the smile had the quality of a woman who had decided to be honest because honesty had become the more interesting strategy. I imagine this appears a certain way to you, Veressa said. What appears a certain way? My presence here, my involvement in the council. Lady Veressa, Seraphine said quietly, I'm a queen. Things do not appear a certain way to me. Things are what they are. I'm simply deciding what they are before I'm told. Silence stretched between them. It was not an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of two intelligent women acknowledging that they are occupying the same territory and neither intends to pretend otherwise. His Majesty speaks highly of you, Veressa said finally. He says you have the sharpest political mind of anyone in Solmora. He's told you that. He has. Seraphine turned back to the window. Below, one of the wiry soldiers had just thrown his partner to the ground with a technique that was more leverage than strength. The trainer had stopped shouting. He was watching with the quiet attention of a man who has just seen something he didn't expect. There are things you understand about a person, Seraphine said, that you only understand after years in the same rooms, same silences, same storms. And there are things a new person understands that you cannot, because you are too close. Both things can be true. She paused. I'm not naive enough to believe that what you offer him has no value. She heard Veressa go still behind her. But I want you to understand something. Seraphine still did not turn. When Solmora was fracturing 7 years ago, I sat beside him through every impossible night. When the frontier lords threatened secession and every minister told him to make concessions that would have gutted this empire's spine, I told him to hold. I told him that strength respected is worth more than weakness accommodated. He listened. He held. They folded. She paused again. That counsel is not something you can offer him, because you weren't there. You can offer him other things. I don't underestimate what those other things are. She turned. Veressa's face had changed. Something honest had moved beneath the performance. What are you telling me? Veressa asked. I'm telling you what I am, Seraphine said, so that later you cannot claim you didn't know. She walked back down the corridor and did not look back once. That evening, she went to the Eastern study she had claimed as her own 2 years into their reign, not because Alaric had offered it, but because she had looked at the palace map, identified the room with the best light and direct access to the library adjacent, and simply arranged her things there over the course of a week until it was understood by everyone that this was her space. The room held 3,000 pages of trade reports, military assessments, provincial census records and letters from border lords, who wrote to her rather than Alaric because they had learned that she responded faster and with more precision. She was deep into a water rights dispute along the Eastern River when Alaric knocked. He knocked. He had not knocked in 2 years. He'd simply entered the way a man enters a room he believes is already his by extension. Come in, she said without looking up. He entered. She heard him cross to the chair across her desk and sit, which meant this was a conversation rather than a visit. She finished the sentence she was reading, then set the page down and looked at him. He looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of a man carrying something he hadn't admitted the weight of yet. The council went well, he said. The council was productive, she agreed. There was a difference. He studied her. She let him. You were quiet. I said what needed saying. You usually say more. I've been editing, she said. He frowned, not in anger, in confusion, which meant he hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice when the editing had begun, which told her everything she needed to know about how long it had been happening. Seraphine. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His scarred hands were clasped. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. I don't have another kind. Are you unhappy? She looked at him for a long moment. The question should have been easier. Are you unhappy? 4 words. But inside the question she could see the shape of what he was actually asking, which was, Are you unhappy in a way that I am responsible for? And if so, is it something I can resolve without changing anything fundamental about what I am currently doing? What would you do with the answer, she asked, if I said yes? He didn't respond immediately. That was its own answer. I've been working through a complicated period, he said carefully. The northern situation is worse than the reports indicate. The Eastern Alliance is fraying. He stopped. New counsel, she said. He looked at her sharply. It's all right, she said, and her voice was steady, and the steadiness was real, not performance, because she had already moved 3 stages past the point where the wound was fresh. You needed something I wasn't providing, or something you stopped looking for in me. I don't know which. Maybe you don't either. That's not Alaric, his name in her mouth, careful, precise. I have watched this court for 9 years. I understand how things move here before they become visible. You know that about me. You've always known that about me. So please don't arrange sentences to protect me from something I already see clearly. He was quiet. Outside the window, Solmora spread in the dark with its 1,000 lit windows like something trying very hard to appear alive. She understands the complexity of what we're facing, he said. The way I think about it, He stopped again. Finishes your sentences, Seraphine said. Something crossed his face. Or offers you the shape of your own thinking held up as a mirror, she continued. That feels like being understood. Sometimes it is understanding. Sometimes it is simply a very good mirror. You're saying she's performing. I'm saying I don't know. That honesty cost her something, but dishonesty would have cost her more. She may be entirely genuine. She may understand you in ways I have stopped trying to. I'm not in a position to read her heart. She folded her hands on the desk. But I'm in a very clear position to see what has happened to mine. The words hung between them like smoke. Alaric's jaw tightened. The scar along his left thumb went pale where his hands clasped harder. This was, she understood, the moment at which a lesser man would deflect into anger, because anger was cleaner and required less of him than grief. Nothing has happened, he said. I know, she said quietly. That's the most honest and most devastating thing you could have told me. She did not sleep well. Not from weeping. She'd moved past that months ago, and she had no patience for going back, but from the particular insomnia of a mind that refused to stop processing. She lay in the dark of her chamber, the one she shared with Alaric in formal terms and alone in practical ones, and she ran the empire through her head the way she always did in her most honest hours. She thought about the Eastern River dispute, about the grain provinces bleeding money westward, about the northern frontier reports that Alaric had said were worse than official accounts. She thought about General Havitt's expression at the council table, the pen that stopped moving. She thought about what an empire feels like when its center of gravity begins to shift. She had grown up in a minor house that had survived 3 political upheavals, not through power, but through the particular genius of her father, who had understood that the most dangerous moment in any system wasn't the crisis itself, but the period just before the crisis, when everyone around you was still pretending the ground was stable. Her father had called it the courtesy of collapse. People were polite about disasters until the disaster was too large to be polite about. She was watching courtesy right now, in the council room, in the amber chamber corridor, in the way Alaric had knocked instead of entered. Courtesy meant the ground was already moving. She rose before dawn. She dressed herself. Prissa slept in the adjacent room, and Seraphine had no patience for ceremony in the dark hours. She wrapped herself in the deep gray traveling cloak she'd had for 11 years, the one with the reinforced hem that dragged through mud without collecting it. She went to her desk and spent 40 minutes writing in the journal she kept in cipher, the one in which she was ruthlessly, dangerously honest. She wrote what she knew. She wrote what she suspected. She wrote what she was not yet willing to say aloud to anyone alive. And then she sat back and read it over, and the experience was like looking at a wound without bandage for the first time. Not pleasurable, but necessary, because you cannot treat what you refuse to fully see. On Alpha, she wrote, is defined not by who stands beside her, but by what she does when the ground shifts. The ground has been shifting for 7 months. I counted incorrectly before because I was measuring by events. Events are late evidence. The shift begins in the small hours, in the changed timbre of a voice, in the absence of a particular kind of attention. I measured too late, but I'm measuring now. And from this point, I measure correctly. She closed the journal and locked it with the key she wore inside her sleeve. Then she went to the window and watched Solmora breathe in the dark for a long time. The empire was beautiful from here. It was always most beautiful from a distance and in insufficient light, which she suspected was true of most things that required enormous energy to maintain. She thought, I did not build this place. I built the invisible architecture beneath this place. The trade agreements, the border relationships, the trust of frontier lords who write to me because they know I answer, the intelligence networks, the diplomatic foundations of 3 fragile alliances that have held because I have spent 9 years learning the names and weaknesses and pride points of every man and woman who controls a critical piece of something. None of that is visible from below. None of that gets commemorated on banners, but it holds. And she thought, when a building is secretly held together by a structure no one can see, what happens when the person who maintains that structure decides to stop? The question surprised her with its own ferocity. Not as threat, not as revenge, as pure and terrible mathematics. What actually happens? She was still standing at the window when Prissa came to find her at the first gray light. The handmaid looked at her face and asked no questions. She simply began to arrange the morning. Prissa, Seraphine said. Yes, my lady. I want every provincial report from the last 6 months, not the summaries, the full records. Border tax collection, road maintenance assessments, local garrison reports, everything. Prissa paused in her arranging. That's several thousand pages. Then clear the East study and start stacking them. Prissa looked at her face specifically, at the particular quality of stillness that had settled there overnight. And something in the handmaid's expression shifted. Not concern, exactly. Something more like witnessing. I'll start immediately, she said. 3 days later, the winter sovereign banquet arrived like an execution dressed in velvet. The great hall of Solmora had been transformed in the way that great halls are transformed for imperial occasions. Flowers brought in from southern greenhouse operations at hideous expense, candles lit in numbers that turned the room into a second sun, long tables covered in white linen pressed sharp enough to cut. Every noble house of significance had sent its best-dressed representatives. The gowns moved like slow water. The jewelry caught the light and threw it back at itself. Wine was poured constantly, which Seraphine understood as the lubrication required to maintain the pretense that everyone was delighted to be present. She wore black. Not mourning black. Not the gray black of absence. The particular black of formal authority. A gown that had been made for her 4 years ago by a seamstress in the Eastern Quarter, who understood that a queen's clothing was not decoration but armor, and that armor needed to be beautiful enough that the person underneath it stopped being considered. She had her hair down for the first time in weeks. It fell to her shoulders with the kind of darkness that the candlelight made interesting. She wore no jewelry except the thin gold cuff on her left wrist that had been her mother's. Not a piece of Solmoran imperial fashion, just a personal object she carried as a reminder that she existed prior to this crown. She stood beside Alaric as court required. He was magnificent in the formal uniform of House Thorn, the black and gold that turned him into the image on the banners outside. They moved through the room and received nobles, and said correct things, and Seraphine smiled with the precision of a woman who had made peace with the performance of marriage, if not the substance of it in this particular season. She was watching Veressa, who was wearing green again, who had positioned herself at the south end of the room, the end closest to the ceremonial dais, who was working the room with the diligence of a person who understood that influence is built, conversation by conversation, that a military commander thanked sincerely will remember you 8 months later when you need something from his garrison. She was good at it. Seraphine had to acknowledge that. The evening moved in its formal patterns, dinner, speeches, the particular political theater of toast that were compliments to recipients while being instructions to everyone else in the room. Then Alaric rose for the final address. I was comfortable at these. His voice had the natural projection of a man who had commanded battlefields. And unlike many powerful men, he understood that brevity in public address was itself a form of strength. He thanked the assembled houses. He spoke of Solmora's continued expansion and stability. He spoke of the alliances that held the empire together. Then he paused, and the quality of the pause was different, and Seraphine felt it in her body before her mind had translated it. This past year has brought new voices to Solmoran Council, he said, new minds that have sharpened our thinking and strengthened our strategy. He turned toward the south end of the room. Lady Veressa Dune of the Southern House has provided counsel of rare quality. In recognition of her contribution to the imperial court's clarity of vision, I am honored to present the silver crest of royal confidence. The crest was already there in the hand of a minister. Silver, palm-sized, the twin wolves facing each other rather than outward. The interior-facing design that denoted intimate trust rather than martial standing. The hall went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of ceremony. The breathless quiet of 300 people understanding simultaneously that something important has just happened, and each of them calculating what it means, and all of them looking toward the same place. Seraphine did not look toward that place. She looked straight forward. The silver crest of royal confidence, given in the last 17 years to 4 people. The king's brother before his death, General Havitt after the Eastern Campaign, Lord Brennan after the fiscal crisis, and once, privately, to her. In their 3rd year, when she had talked him back from a decision that would have fractured 2 critical alliances, and he had given her the crest with his forehead pressed to hers, and his voice very low and rough. There are 6 people in my life I trust without condition. You are the first. That was 9 years ago. Now the room was full of a silence that weighed more than stone, and every person in it was watching her. She felt their attention the way you feel heat, not always comfortable, but always informative. She felt the ministers who owed her favors recalibrating their calculations. The frontier lords' representatives who wrote to her offices and were now reviewing their dependencies. Lord Brennan, who she had pulled back from the financial edge twice, not looking at her at all. The specific avoidance of a man who does not know what to do with what he has just witnessed. General Havitt was watching her directly. His scar tissue jaw was set. His eyes held a question she recognized because it was her own question, dressed differently. Where does this go from here? Alaric returned to his seat. He sat beside her. He did not look at her directly, which told her that he knew, somewhere beneath the architecture of his certainty, what he had just done. Seraphine picked up her wine glass. She drank from it with the steady hand of a woman who had decided that her composure was her sword, her shield, and the last wall between herself and what she was about to have to do. The banquet resumed its patterns. She stayed through the end of it, because leaving early was an announcement of injury, and she refused to give the court that satisfaction. She stayed, and she smiled, and she spoke when spoken to, and she remembered every face that offered her sympathy, and every face that could not meet her eyes, because in an empire, memory was survival, and she had just been handed a reason to remember everything. When she finally walked back through the palace corridors, her footsteps the only sound in the high-ceilinged passage, she did not go to the chambers she shared with Alaric. She went to the East Study, and she opened the door to find 3 months of provincial reports stacked in precise rows, and a candle Prisa had left lit against her return. She sat. She looked at the stacks. 6,000 pages of a fracturing empire. And for the first time in 9 years, Seraphine Vale did not ask herself what Solmora needed from her. She asked herself what she needed from Solmora. He came to her at the midnight hour. She heard the knock and let him wait the length of time it took her to finish the paragraph she was reviewing. Then she said, "Come in." He looked the way powerful men look when they have done something they cannot quite defend and have not yet decided whether to defend it anyway. His formal jacket was open at the collar. He'd removed the chain of office. He was Alaric Thorne in the version that existed before the throne, and she had once loved that version with a completeness that would have frightened her if she'd known what it was going to cost. He looked at the stacked reports around her. "You're working," he said. "I'm always working." He came fully into the room and closed the door. He stood in the way that men stand when they want to seem at ease and are not. "The banquet was very beautiful," she said. "The flowers from the southern greenhouse, the candles. The coordination was excellent. Selden's staff deserve acknowledgement." His jaw set. "Seraphine. The silver crest." She set the page down and looked at him. "Explain it to me." "She has contributed significantly. She has been here 5 weeks. Her voice was precise, not loud. She had no use for loud. "The crest has been given 4 times in 17 years, and each of those 4 times it carried the weight of years of proven, critical service. You gave it to a woman who has been present for 5 weeks, in public, in front of every house in Solmora." She paused. "So explain it to me, not as ceremony, as decision." He was quiet. Outside the study window, Solmora's lights were going out one by one. The palace was quieting down around them. "She understands," he began. "Don't." Seraphine's voice was very soft. Please don't say she understands you, because what follows that sentence will be the cruelest thing you have said to me in 9 years, and I do not think you understand that yet. He stopped. He looked at her, and she could see, in the working of his face, that he was arriving somewhere he hadn't been willing to arrive, and that the arriving was hurting him, and that a part of her noted the hurt with the clinical accuracy of a woman who had decided that his pain was no longer automatically her responsibility. I haven't broken, he started. A body can betray once, she said. A heart betrays daily. She watched those words hit him. You have been giving her what used to come to me, not your body. I understand you believe that is the only line that matters. I'm telling you it is not the most important line. Every morning you woke up and decided to seek her out instead of me. Every strategy session where you brought her conclusions already formed so the council would receive them as hers. Every fear you shared with her in those long meetings that once lasted past midnight in this very room with me. Her voice did not shake. She had decided it would not. Those are daily decisions. Made consciously or not, they are made. And each one is a choice about where your loyalty actually lives. Alaric Thorne, who had faced frontier armies and political crises and the accumulated violence of an empire's consolidation, stood in her study, looking like a man who was seeing something for the first time he should have seen years ago. Seraphine, No, she said. Not tonight. She looked at him very steadily. Tonight is not the night for what you want to say. Tonight I need you to go. Because I have 6,000 pages of a fracturing empire to understand, and I find I cannot do that and hold your feelings at the same time, and I have decided that the empire is more urgent. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, When did you become like this? Like what? Like a wall. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she answered, and when she answered, it was with the stillness of a woman who has been so thoroughly tested that she has moved through the breaking point and discovered what remains on the other side. I became a wall, she said, the day I realized I was the only one left defending the door. He left. The study was very quiet afterward. She picked up the first stack of provincial reports and opened it to the Eastern River Territories, and she began to read. She read through midnight. She read into the cold hours before dawn when the candle guttered and she lit another. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, in the census records of the northern frontier provinces, she found something that made her stop. A pattern, buried under 6 months of routine administrative correspondence. Supply requisitions delayed by weeks with no explanation. Garrison rotation records that didn't match the officer postings. Tax collection figures that diverged between local records and the ministerial summaries presented to the king. Diverged. Not slightly, systematically. Someone had been editing the reports before they reached the council. Someone with access to the ministerial layer. Someone who understood which numbers to adjust and which to leave alone. Someone who had been doing it carefully enough that the overall picture remained plausible while individual pieces drifted toward a specific outcome. She laid the pages flat on the desk and placed them in order and looked at them for a long time. An empire does not fracture from outside first. It fractures from inside, in the ministries, in the administrative corridors, in the places where information is filtered before it reaches the people who need it to make decisions. She thought of Veressa, the Eastern Trade Framework discussed with His Majesty before the Council, the amber chambers with the private corridor. The woman who had arrived 5 weeks ago from the south with devastating precision and placed herself exactly where the information flowed. She thought of the silver crest, the prestige, the credibility. And she thought of what you could do with credibility in a palace where the king was emotionally distracted and the queen had been quietly displaced. Her hand found the cipher journal. She opened it. She wrote 3 lines. Then she stopped, because she heard something. From the corridor outside the east study. A soft sound. The particular quality of footsteps trying not to be footsteps. Stopping outside the study door. Not Prissa. Not Alaric. She sat perfectly still. The footsteps retreated. She went to the door and opened it. The corridor was empty. But at the end of the corridor, just rounding the corner toward the amber chambers, the hem of a deep green dress was disappearing from sight. Seraphine stood in her doorway in the middle of the night with 6,000 pages of a doctored empire behind her and a locked cipher journal in her hand, and the realization settling into her chest like iron. Veressa had not come to Solmora to be near a king. She had come to The candle threw Seraphine's shadow large across the ceiling as she turned back toward the desk. Her hand was on the journal. Her breath was entirely steady. In the stack of Northern Frontier records, one page sat face up, a garrison report from the border fortress of Kale Crossing, the easternmost military outpost in Solmora. The last entry was dated 11 days ago. The reported troop strength was 400, but the supply requisition from 3 weeks prior had been made for 600 soldiers' rations. And the name at the bottom of the supply order was not the garrison commander's. It was a name Seraphine had seen once before, at the bottom of a trade framework discussed with the king in private. She picked up the page. She looked at it in the candlelight. And for the first time since the ground had started shifting, she was not afraid. She was something far more dangerous than afraid. She was certain. She stayed at the desk until the candle burned to its collar. The garrison report from Kale Crossing sat in the center of the desk, like an accusation that had not yet decided who to accuse. Seraphine read it 4 more times, not because the numbers changed, but because certainty is a dangerous thing to carry incorrectly, and she had spent 9 years watching men act on incomplete certainty and call the wreckage that followed decisive leadership. She would not make that error. She read until she was sure she was sure. Then she set the page down and looked at the wall and let the architecture of what she now understood build itself in her mind without interference. The supply requisition was signed with a name she recognized. Myron Voss, Trade Liaison, Southern House, Opas Bachinchangche. On paper, she was a secondary attaché to Lord Dune's commercial interests, a position so unremarkable in the ministerial hierarchy that it existed specifically to be unremarkable. You put the people doing your most dangerous work in the rooms that no one thinks to watch. Seraphine had learned that from her father, who had learned it the hard way. She thought about the nature of patience, real patience, not the performative waiting that most people mistake for it. Real patience is an act of violence done slowly. It requires the suppression of every instinct that says, move now, strike now, because the instinct is almost always correct about direction and almost always wrong about timing. Veressa Dune had been building this for longer than 5 weeks. You do not execute a plan this layered in 5 weeks. 5 weeks is simply when Seraphine had become aware of the visible layer. The infrastructure beneath it was older, more patient, more frightening, which meant the question was not what Veressa was doing. The question was what she had already done. The distinction mattered enormously. Seraphine opened the cipher journal and began writing in the tight, economical hand she used when she needed to move fast without losing precision. She listed what she knew with certainty. She listed what she could infer. She listed what remained unknown and therefore most dangerous. She drew the lines between them. She was not an emotional person in the sense that most people meant that phrase. She felt things precisely and deeply, but she had long since learned to treat feeling as information rather than instruction. Her anger, which was present and cold and thorough, told her that the situation was serious. Her fear, which was smaller than the anger but more honest, told her that she had been slower than she should have been, and that this error had a cost she could not yet calculate. Her intellect, which was the part she trusted most, told her to move carefully and to move now. She wrote one final line in the journal, locked it, and stood. She would not sleep. She had no use for sleep tonight. She went to find General Havitt. He kept late hours in the northern garrison office, a room in the lower palace that smelled of weapon oil and old paper, and the particular staleness of a space occupied by someone who considered comfort a strategic liability. The guard at the door recognized her and stepped aside without a word. She had established that particular protocol 2 years ago, during the Eastern Corridor crisis, when she'd needed midnight access to military intelligence without creating a record of the request. Havitt looked up from the map table when she entered. His scarred jaw tightened once, then released. He was a man who processed surprise quickly and set it aside in favor of practicality. "My Lady Queen," he said it quietly. His aide was in the corner, and Havitt dismissed him with 2 words before Seraphine had fully closed the door. She crossed to the map table and placed the garrison report from Kale Crossing in front of him. He looked at it. He picked it up. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she knew he was reading it, the same way she had read it, with the same systematic discomfort of a military mind encountering numbers that don't cohere. "Where'd you find this?" he said. Not a question, an assessment. "Provincial records, unedited. The ministerial summaries don't contain it." He set the page down carefully. His eyes went to the map. Kale Crossing was marked at the far eastern edge, the last fortress before the border territories where Solmoran authority technically held but practically frayed. 200 soldiers unaccounted for in the supply record. Either the garrison is larger than reported, she said, or the supplies are going somewhere other than the garrison. Either way, he looked at her. Someone in the ministerial layer is managing the information. Yes. The question is who they're managing it for. She put Marin Voss's name on the table between them. Not written. She said it aloud, quietly. She watched his face. The slight compression around his eyes told her he recognized it, which told her he'd encountered the name in contexts adjacent to something he'd already found uncomfortable. Dune's liaison, he said, stationed in the palace for 3 months, before Veressa arrived. The silence in the garrison office had weight to it now. The map on the table between them was not just cartography, it was the shape of what they were standing inside. Havitt leaned back. He was a man who had survived because he knew when to be slow and when to be fast. She watched him decide which this was. If I start pulling garrison records from the Eastern Territories, he said carefully, that creates a paper trail. Which is why I'm not asking you to pull records officially. Unofficially, then. He looked at her steadily. You understand what you're asking. I understand exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to help me find out how serious a problem we have before it becomes the kind of problem that doesn't have a solution other than a military one. She held his gaze. I'm asking you because you stopped writing during the council meeting when Veressa presented an arrangement she had already discussed with the king in private. And I'm asking you because I know your loyalty is to Solmora and not to anyone's proximity to it. Havitt was quiet. He looked at the garrison report. Then he looked at the Queen of Solmora standing in his garrison office at 2 hours past midnight with a cipher-locked journal under her arm and no fear in her face, only the particular cold clarity of a woman who has decided that what she knows is more important than what she is supposed to know. Give me 4 days, he said. You have 3. A ghost of something. Not quite a smile, but the close equivalent from a man whose face rarely moved toward warmth, crossed his scarred jaw. Yes, my lady. She slept 2 hours before dawn and rose feeling not rested but reset, which was a different thing and served the same functional purpose. Prisa had already arranged the morning chamber, and when Seraphine appeared she looked at the queen the way she had taken to looking at her these past weeks, with the attention of someone watching a familiar landscape shift beneath good light, noting the changes without yet naming them. Lord Brennan has requested a private audience, Prisa said. He sent the request at midnight. Midnight, after the banquet, after the Silver Crest presentation. He can have it at mid-morning, Seraphine said. My office, not the council chamber. She dressed deliberately. Dark green, not the Southern House green, her own version of it, a color that, in Solmoran court tradition, carried the meaning of sustained authority rather than borrowed prestige. She wanted Brennan to feel, when he looked at her, that the ground was stable. Men in financial crisis needed the ground to feel stable before they would tell you the true shape of the trouble. Brennan arrived at mid-morning, looking the way Treasury Lords look when they have been carrying something frightening for a long time and have finally decided that carrying it alone is more dangerous than the risk of disclosure. He was 61 years old, narrow in the way that anxious men become narrow over years of sustained tension, with the kind of hands that were always slightly clasped, whether the situation called for it or not. He sat across from her desk. She waited. The skill of waiting without filling the silence was one she had cultivated with deliberate patience, because men like Brennan needed to arrive at the point themselves, or the information was half as reliable. The Eastern trade arrangement, he said finally, the one Lady Veressa presented. The one discussed with the king before the council. He met her eyes. There are figures in that arrangement, my lady, that I cannot reconcile with the ministry's current accounts. She kept her face neutral. Tell me. The arrangement calls for a credit extension from the southern trade houses, specifically a collateral bridge covering 6 months of Eastern corridor losses. The collateral is proposed against projected revenues from the Kale Crossing trade route. He paused. The Kale Crossing route has been inactive for 2 years. There are no projected revenues to bridge against. Seraphine was quiet for 3 full seconds. Who approved the figures? The arrangement hasn't been formally approved. It was presented as a framework for deeper review. He looked at her with the discomfort of a man saying something that frightens him. But the ministerial stamp on the preliminary assessment, The document that makes it an official proposal rather than a casual suggestion, was placed by Undersecretary Talon 3 days before the council met. Before Lady Veressa had even formally presented it, before His Majesty had reviewed it in the context of the full council. The arrangement had been logged as official before it was presented as new. Someone had been building the paper architecture beneath the idea before the idea had been shown to the people who were supposed to evaluate it. By the time it appeared in the council chamber, it already technically existed as an imperial document. Seraphine looked at the surface of her desk for a moment. Then she looked at Brennan. "How long have you known this?" His hands clasped tighter. "I noticed the stamp date 2 days ago. I've been verifying." He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man releasing pressure he'd built up over 48 hours. "There are 3 other ministerial documents in the past 2 months with similar discrepancies. Timestamps that precede the conversations they're supposedly recording. Approvals for arrangements that weren't finalized until after the official record says they were. Someone was not just editing information as it moved upward. Someone was creating information before it existed, pre-building the record of a palace that had already decided what the palace was going to decide. The level of access required for this was not peripheral, it was central. "You came to me," she said, "not to the king." Brennan looked at her with the direct, exhausted honesty of a man who has run out of careful language. "My lady, the preliminary financial framework for this arrangement carries the notation discussed and conceptually approved by His Majesty during private council." The room was very quiet. "I see," she said. She said nothing else. She let him sit with the weight of what he had brought her, and she let herself sit with the weight of what it meant. This was the courtesy of collapse made into document. This was the invisible architecture being replaced, piece by piece, by someone else's invisible architecture. And the man who should have been paying attention had been spending his attention elsewhere. An alpha's greatest vulnerability, she understood with the kind of clarity that only comes from having loved one, is not aggression. It is the specific blindness that comes from being too long at the center of everything. A man who has always been the gravitational point of a room stops being able to see the room objectively, because everyone in the room is always oriented toward him. He becomes the measuring instrument and the thing being measured simultaneously. It is not stupidity. It is the structural deformation that power performs on perception. Alaric was not a foolish man. He was a man who had spent 17 years at the center, and Veressa Dune had understood this with surgical precision. She had not seduced him with beauty, though beauty had opened the door. She had seduced him with the experience of being seen by someone who had no political history with him, no memory of his failures, no accumulated record of his contradictions. She offered him the intoxicating simplicity of being understood without the complication of being known. It is a specific cruelty that the most intelligent men are often most vulnerable to this, because they spend their lives in rooms where everyone knows the shape of their authority, and they forget what it felt like to simply be seen without the crown. Seraphine had known the crown and the man beneath it simultaneously. That was her specific gift, and for a time, his specific dependence. But dependence on the true version of a person is harder to maintain than dependence on the ideal version. The true version requires work, requires honesty, requires the willingness to be held accountable by someone who actually knows your history. Veressa offered the ideal version, clean, without cost. It was always going to be the more seductive option. Understanding this did not make it hurt less, but it gave it a shape she could work with. She thanked Brennan. She sent him away. She asked him, carefully, to continue verifying without formally recording his verification until she indicated otherwise. He understood. He was grateful for the instruction because it meant someone was holding the situation and he did not have to carry it alone any further. When he left, she sat for a while with the silence. Then she picked up her pen and began drafting a letter to the Lord of the Eastern Border Territories. She did not see Alaric until dinner that evening, the private dinner that court protocol required the king and queen to share 3 times per week, regardless of the state of the marriage it nominally represented. She had come to see these dinners as a performance she had once resented and now understood as useful. Useful because the performance forced a kind of contact that would otherwise cease entirely, and contact, even formal contact, created information. He was already at the table when she arrived, which was unusual. He typically arrived last. The fact of his early arrival meant something had unsettled him, and he had needed the room before she could take it. She sat. The servants moved through the opening courses with the trained invisibility of palace staff, filling and removing and disappearing. Alaric ate without speaking for the first several minutes. This, she knew, was not coldness. It was the processing pattern of a man who had a thing to say that he had not yet assembled into a form he trusted. She waited. Veressa intends to return south, he said finally. Seraphine set down her fork with complete calm. When? She mentioned it this morning, said she'd accomplished what she came for. Something moved in his jaw. I asked her to stay. She declined. The information landed precisely where it needed to land, and Seraphine spent exactly 0 visible energy on the impact. She thought, she is pulling back. She thought, there are 2 reasons a player pulls back. Either the game has been won, or the game has been discovered. She thought, which is this? Did she say what she'd accomplished? Seraphine asked. She said the trade arrangement was in good shape for final approval, and that her presence here was becoming... He stopped. Complicated, Seraphine offered. He looked at her sharply. She said conspicuous. The same word, dressed better. She picked up her fork again. When does she leave? She didn't give a date. I was watching her with the expression of a man who had expected a different reaction and was now revising something. She understood the revision. He had expected, perhaps, relief. Or residual bitterness, something he could read as emotional and therefore manage. She was giving him neither because what she was feeling was not relief and not bitterness. What she was feeling was the cold, alert focus of a woman who has just realized that the timing of an exit is always a message. Alaric, she said carefully, do you know what the trade arrangement uses as its financial collateral? He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. The Eastern Corridor projections, KL Crossing. She watched his face. The inactive route. Silence. I reviewed the arrangement, he said slowly. Did you review the preliminary assessment document? The one that carried the ministerial timestamp from before the council meeting? His fork went still. The ministerial record indicates the arrangement was formally logged 3 days before it was presented to you, she said. The financial framework uses a collateral basis that doesn't exist. And the garrison supply records from Kale Crossing, the actual unedited provincial records, rather than the ministerial summaries, indicate a 200-soldier discrepancy that no one has formally explained. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched the sequence move across his face. Disbelief first, which was honest. Then the particular quality of a man whose mind was capable, when properly engaged, of moving very fast. Then something she had not seen on his face in 2 years. The look he'd worn during the Eastern Corridor crisis when he'd finally understood the shape of the problem and had turned to her and said, tell me what I'm missing. You've been building this, he said. I've been reading the provincial records you haven't had time to read. She kept her voice neutral. Someone has been managing the information layer between the provinces and the council. The nature of what's being managed suggests the purpose is to position a specific financial arrangement as inevitable before anyone examines it critically. That arrangement would give a Southern trade network, specifically houses affiliated with Lord Dune, primary collateral access to Solmora's Eastern Corridor, which is not a trade arrangement. It is a mortgage on a strategic military route. Alaric put down his fork. He was very still the way he was still in battles. The specific stillness that preceded action. Why are you telling me this at dinner? He said. And there was something in his voice, not accusation exactly, but the roughness of a man who was suddenly and acutely aware of the cost of what he had not been paying attention to. Because tomorrow, I'm going to the Eastern Territories. He looked up. Officially, I'm making a routine inspection of provincial administration, which is something I should have done 6 months ago and didn't, because I was occupied with other concerns. She met his gaze steadily. Unofficially, I need eyes on Kyle Crossing before anyone who is watching this palace understands that the records have been found. Seraphine. His voice had changed, stripped of the careful distance of recent months. Just her name, direct, the way it used to sound. This is not something you handle alone. I've been handling things alone for a while now. She said it without heat, without performance, as a simple fact offered without comment. I have the capacity. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it and watched it cost him something, and she had the thought, clear and cold, that his pain at this moment was appropriate and she would not rush to soothe it. The garrison at Kale Crossing, he said slowly. If there are 200 soldiers that haven't been officially reported, then someone is maintaining a private force in an imperial military installation under a borrowed supply line. She finished the mathematics for him, so he could hear the answer fully. That is not a trade dispute. That is the preparation for something else. The dinner table between them felt very far across. Veressa, he said. Her name in his mouth had changed quality entirely. I don't know what she knows, Seraphine said. I don't know if she is the architect of this, or an instrument of it, or a distraction created alongside it. All three are possible. I need to know which before we move against any of it, because the wrong move at the wrong target gives the person who designed this exactly the reaction they're anticipating. I was watching her with an expression she had not seen in so long, it took her a moment to identify it. It was the look of a man remembering something he had put down carelessly and now understood he needed. You've already spoken to Have It, he said, 3 days ago. And Brennan came to you. Not a question. Last night, he leaned back. He put his hands flat on the table. His scarred knuckles were pale. She watched him do the accounting that she had already done, the accounting of where his people had brought their knowledge and their fear, and to which member of the crown they had directed their trust, and what the geography of that trust indicated about what had happened in his palace under his authority while he had been looking at a green dress and mistaking admiration for clarity. The silence between them was different from the silences of recent months. Those had been avoidant. This one was exposed. I owe you, he began. Not tonight, she said. Her voice was firm, not cold. There was a difference she needed him to understand. What you owe me is not a conversation we can have until this is handled, because the moment we begin it, we stop being able to do our jobs correctly. And right now our jobs are more important than our marriage. She looked at him directly. I need you to keep Veressa here, whatever it takes. Don't let her leave until I get back. He stared at her. Whatever you have to say to her, Seraphine said, and the words came from somewhere very steady inside her, somewhere that had moved past the wound and into the territory beyond it. Say it. I need 3 days, and I need her contained. The asking of this was one of the more remarkable things she had ever done. She recognized it as such without sentiment. He recognized it too. She could see that. 3 days, he said. 3 days. He nodded once. The way he nodded to generals before a campaign. Without ceremony. Without pretense. With the full weight of intent. She rose from the table. Seraphine. His voice caught her at the door. She stopped but didn't turn. The Eastern Trade Framework. When you find what's at Kale Crossing, he paused. Be careful. She considered the request. Considered the man making it. Considered 9 years of palace halls and war councils and frozen gardens at midnight and a silver crest given to another woman in front of every house in the empire. I know how to be careful, she said. I've been doing it alone long enough. She left. The eastern road out of Solmora's capital was not the road the empire put in its portraits. It was stone that had cracked along its center seam 2 winters ago and hadn't been fully repaired, wide enough for 2 carriages but unpaved at the margins where the provinces had run short of materials and short of priorities. Seraphine rode it before dawn the following morning in a closed coach with 2 outriders she trusted, and Prissa, who had packed without asking for explanation and asked for none. The empire looked different from this road. You forget, inside a palace made of marble and mirrors, that an empire is mostly its middle distances, the villages that appear between the capital's influence and the frontier's exposure, the farmhouses, the small lords' estates, the markets that served the people who actually produced the things that made the treasury numbers mean something. She had traveled these roads before, years ago, in the first months of the reign, when Alaric had insisted on a joint circuit of the territories to establish the new administration's legitimacy in physical terms. She had loved those months. The road had been rough, and the accommodations had been inconsistent, and she had been exhausted from travel in a way that palace life made impossible, and she had felt more real than she had felt before or since. She watched the landscape through the coach window and let it speak to her. What it said was not reassuring. 2 villages in the first 40 miles showed the specific poverty of places that had stopped expecting improvement, roofs that needed repair, a mill with a broken wheel that had clearly been broken for more than 1 season, children who watched the coach pass with the flat assessment of people too young to have learned to perform hope for passing nobility. This was not the poverty of disaster, it was the poverty of sustained neglect, Which is a different thing because neglect requires active choice to maintain. Someone was choosing this. Not Alaric. She did not believe he knew the granular shape of it. But in every ministry, there were people responsible for provincial welfare assessments and road maintenance schedules and mill repair allocations. And in every ministry, there were people who had learned that funds marked for provincial maintenance could be quietly redirected if the provincial reports reaching the capital were edited correctly. She thought of Marin Voss. She thought of the 3 months Voss had spent in the palace before Veressa arrived. You do not build an information management system in 3 months. You inherit one. You find the people who have already been quietly redirecting things, and you explain to them that you can make their situation either worse or better. And the choice depends on their willingness to manage the flow a little differently going forward. The existing corruption becomes the foundation of the new corruption. The brilliant efficiency of it was almost admirable if you could set aside what it was doing to the people living under broken mill wheels. The coach reached the Kale Crossing fortress at the end of the second day. It was larger than she'd expected. Not monumentally large, it was a frontier installation, built for function rather than statement, but it was in better repair than anything she'd passed in the last 40 miles, which was itself a message. Resources were flowing here. They were simply not flowing through the channels that the ministerial summaries acknowledged. She presented herself as a routine administrative inspection, which created immediate administrative anxiety in the garrison's duty officer, a young man of about 26, who had the particular expression of someone confronted with an authority he had not prepared for. We had no notice of an inspection, he said. Inspections are less useful with notice, she said pleasantly. She asked to see the garrison rolls. He brought them. She reviewed them with Prissa beside her recording figures in the inventory ledger they had brought for the purpose. The rolls showed 412 soldiers. She walked the garrison yard and counted differently. She counted by the practical evidence of habitation, the number of boot sets outside the barracks, the volume of the evening meal being prepared in the garrison kitchen, the capacity of the latrine trenches, which were always the most honest indicator of population, because you cannot fake sanitation and no one thinks to edit it. The garrison held closer to 600 bodies. She completed her inspection without varying her expression. She asked for the garrison commander, a man named Vort, who was broad and competent looking, and who had the specific quality of a man waiting to be asked the wrong question. The supply requisition for last quarter, she said to him, the one signed by Marin Voss. Vort's face did something very small and very fast. Standard logistics coordination, he said. The southern trade houses have been supplementing supply during the corridor reconstruction period. The corridor has been inactive for 2 years. Reconstruction takes time, my lady. And the additional personnel. She kept her voice administrative, mild, curious rather than accusatory, the tone of an official counting inventory rather than building a case. I count more boots than your rolls account for. Something moved behind Vort's eyes. Not fear exactly. The calculation of a man deciding between 2 forms of danger and choosing the one he knows the shape of. Seasonal labor for the route preparation, he said. They're not formally enrolled. No, she agreed. They're not formally anything. She let the silence sit. Then she asked for his complete supply records, the unedited originals, and when he hesitated for exactly 2 seconds longer than an innocent man would hesitate, she looked at him with the full, unhurried authority of a woman who has been a queen for 9 years and has run out of patience for the courtesy of collapse. Commander Vort, she said quietly, I'm going to be very direct with you. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to understand what you are part of and what you believe you were promised for being part of it. Those are 2 different questions, and the answers to them will determine what happens next for you personally. She paused. But I need the records. And I need them before the person who told you this installation was protected has the opportunity to tell you otherwise. The air in the commander's office was absolutely still. Vort looked at her for a long time. Then he opened the drawer to his left and placed a ledger on the table between them that was significantly thicker than anything he'd shown her before. She opened it. She read. The numbers inside were not a trade arrangement. They were a mobilization plan. Dates. Supply volumes. Weapons requisitions marked as agricultural equipment in the official record. A timeline with the first phase marked as complete and the second phase marked with a date that was 11 days from today. At the bottom of the final page, above the authorization signature, was a single line of instruction that had been written by hand and not in any ministerial cipher she recognized. Await confirmation from the capital before advancing to Phase 3. She closed the ledger. She looked at Vort. "When did you receive your last communication from the capital?" she said. He swallowed. 2 days ago. And the next confirmation was expected. Tomorrow, he said. If certain events in the capital proceeded as planned. She thought of Veressa, announcing her departure, pulling back at the precise moment that would create maximum disruption and minimum trackable involvement, the confirmation, the signal. If certain events in the capital proceeded as planned, if the Silver Crest had done what it was meant to do, not flatter a woman, but destabilize a queen, push Seraphine out of position, create the kind of internal palace disruption that turned every minister's attention inward, toward the marriage and the insult and the court drama, while the eastern border prepared for something the council had been systematically prevented from seeing clearly. Seraphine stood up. She was very calm, the kind of calm that is not peace, but the thing that comes after you have passed through the heat of something and arrived on the other side of it. "You will send tomorrow's confirmation," she said to Vort. "As expected. No alteration, no warning." He stared at her. "I am not asking," she said. He nodded. She took the ledger. She walked out of the garrison commander's office into the cold morning air of the eastern frontier, and she looked northeast along the inactive corridor where the road disappeared into territory that was technically Solmoran and practically something that was about to be tested. And she understood with complete and terrible clarity that she had not come east to understand how serious a problem they had. She had come east to find a war that had been scheduled for Solmora without Solmora's knowledge. 11 days. She turned to Prisa, who was standing 2 paces behind her with the inventory ledger and the expression of a woman who has understood, from body language alone, that what they had just found was not an administrative irregularity. "Ride back tonight," Seraphine said. "Take the northern trace, not the main road. Carry this." She gave her the ledger. "Inside the supply bag. No courier, no station change, you personally." Prisa took it without hesitation. "And Prisa?" Seraphine met her eyes directly. "Find General Havett before you find anyone else. Tell him the word I said to tell him if I found what I expected to find." "What word, my lady?" Seraphine looked back at the garrison, at the 600 soldiers who existed on no official roll, at the weapons marked as plows, at the road that led to a border that had 11 days left of peace. It didn't know it had. "Tell him," she said, "that it's already started." Prisa rode through the night. Seraphine watched her go from the garrison gate until the horse became a shape, and the shape became nothing, and the darkness swallowed both. Then she turned back inside and spent the remaining hours before dawn doing the only productive thing available to her, which was thinking without the luxury of stopping. She had 11 days according to the ledger. She had less than that in practice, because the ledger was the optimistic version, the version written before anyone knew the records had been found. The moment Vort sent tomorrow's confirmation signal, and it was received without the expected follow-up from Veressa, someone in the chain would understand that the silence meant something had gone wrong. How quickly they moved after that depended on how much redundancy had been built into the plan, and plans this carefully constructed always had redundancy. She gave herself 8 days, possibly 6. The mathematics of the situation were not comfortable, but they were workable, which was the only quality she required of a problem at this stage. Workable meant she had not yet run out of options. She had learned to treat the existence of any option at all as a form of abundance, because she had sat beside Alaric during enough genuine crises to understand what it felt like when the options were truly exhausted, and this was not that. Not yet. She walked the garrison perimeter alone in the dark, which she understood was not a safe thing to do, and did anyway, because the perimeter was where she could think without walls absorbing her thoughts back at her. The 600 soldiers who existed in no official record were quartered in the northern barracks. She could hear them, the ambient human sound of a large number of people existing in close quarters, coughing and shifting, and the low conversation of men on night watch. They were not Solmoran military. Their equipment, from what she'd observed during the inspection, was Solmoran in style but not in marking. Private equipment. The kind a man brings when he is hired rather than conscripted. A hired army inside an imperial garrison. She thought about the audacity of it. The sheer architectural audacity required to build this inside Solmora's own frontier without the frontier's knowledge. It required patience and access, and the specific genius of understanding that an empire's greatest vulnerability is not its borders, but its paperwork. Control the paperwork, and you control what the empire believes is true about itself. And an empire that has lost accurate knowledge of its own condition is an empire that cannot defend against what it does not know is coming. This was not a trade dispute. This was not political maneuvering between houses. This was an invasion that had been assembled inside the house it intended to occupy. The question she had not yet answered, the one that kept returning with the persistence of something she needed to stop avoiding, was whether Alaric's involvement with Veressa had been engineered from the beginning as a distraction, or whether Veressa had found an existing weakness and simply widened it. The distinction mattered because it told her something about the intelligence behind the plan. If Veressa had engineered Alaric's emotional dependence deliberately and from the outset, she was dealing with a strategist who thought in years. If Veressa had simply identified a fracturing marriage and inserted herself into the gap, she was dealing with an opportunist who thought in months, years or months. The answer changed everything about what came next. She returned to the garrison office before first light and wrote 3 letters by the camp lantern. One to Lord Fenwick of the northeastern border territories, whose garrison lay between Kale Crossing and the next defensible position. One to the trademaster at the river crossing 60 miles north, a man named Ossel, who owed her a favor she had never collected and who had eyes on supply movement along the northern trace. One to a woman in this capital whose name she kept in no official correspondence and whose existence in Seraphine's network of knowledge she had protected for 4 years precisely for a moment like this. She sealed all 3 with plain wax. No royal mark. She gave them to 3 different outriders, with 3 different routes, and 3 different cover stories. Then she sat back and accepted that she had done everything she could do from this position and that the next move required her to be somewhere she was not. She needed to be in the capital. She needed to be there before Prisa arrived with the ledger, because Prisa traveling alone on the northern trace would take 2 days, and Seraphine taking the main road with the outriders could make it in a day and a half, and the 12 hours of differential could be the difference between managing what she'd found and being managed by it. She rode out before the garrison finished its morning drill. The capital announced itself the way capitals always do, not suddenly, but through accumulation. The road widened, the maintenance improved, the villages grew denser and then became outskirts, and the outskirts became districts, and the districts became the city that Solmora's empire centered itself on and called its heart. She arrived at the palace gate in the late afternoon of the second day, tired in the way that was physical rather than emotional, her body stiff from the road and her mind completely alive. The gate guards recognized her, and the gate opened, and she was through before anyone had time to send word ahead, which was exactly what she required. She went directly to the east study. She stopped in the doorway. Havett was already there. I was standing at the map table. He was not alone. Beside him stood Lord Brennan, who looked like a man who had not slept in 2 days and had been subsisting on his own anxiety. And across from both of them, seated in the chair Seraphine typically occupied, was Alaric. He looked up when she entered. His face did something complicated and fast that she didn't have time to fully inventory. "You're back early," he said. "I found what I went looking for faster than I expected." She came fully into the room and closed the door and looked at Havett. "Prisa is still on the northern trace. She has the primary ledger, but I have the numbers." She went to the map table and spread her notes, written in the plain hand she used when cipher would take too long, across the surface. 600 unregistered soldiers at Kyle Crossing, weapons inventory logged as agricultural supply, a mobilization timeline with Phase 2, marked complete in Phase 3, set to activate in, she paused and calculated, 9 days from today. The room was very quiet. Havett looked at the notes with the expression of a soldier receiving intelligence he had suspected and hoped was wrong. Brennan's hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone the color of old bone. Alaric looked at the map. "Phase 3 activation requires a confirmation signal from the capital," she continued. "Vort sent the expected confirmation this morning on my instruction. Whoever receives it will expect a follow-up from the capital within 48 hours. She looked at Alaric directly. "Which means we have 48 hours before the absence of that follow-up tells them something has gone wrong, and they move to contingency." Alaric stood up. He looked at the map the way she had seen him look at maps before battles, with the total attention of a man who was no longer thinking about anything except the problem in front of him. This was the version of him she had built an empire beside. She was glad it was still there. She had been less certain of that than she wanted to admit. "Have it," he said. "Northern Garrison. What do you need?" 6 hours to move the right people into position, and 4 hours to get orders to Fennec without going through the ministerial layer. Havett's voice was what it always was, flat and direct and entirely without performance. "The ministerial layer is compromised. I move through captains I personally certified. Do it." "There is another matter," Seraphine said. Both men looked at her. "Veressa is still in the palace." Alaric's jaw set. "I kept her here, as you asked." "I know, and I need to speak with her before you move any military asset, because until I understand whether she is the architect of this or a piece of it, I do not know whether she has a communication channel that can alert the people at Kale Crossing faster than we can move to close it." She looked at Alaric steadily. "I need the conversation first. Then you move." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She turned and left the room to find Veressa Dune. There are moments in the life of any person who has operated in environments of sustained power and sustained deception when the mask becomes a liability instead of a protection. The moment always comes faster than the wearer anticipates, because the mask is optimized for the conditions that existed when it was first constructed, and conditions change, and a mask that cannot change with them becomes the most visible thing in the room. Seraphine had thought about this on the road coming back. She had thought about what Veressa's face would do when she understood that the thing she had built, carefully, patiently, with extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary coldness, had been found. Not by the people she had managed and manipulated and maneuvered, by the one person she had systematically tried to remove from the equation. The amber chambers were at the end of the corridor where Seraphine had seen the green hem of a dress disappearing 3 nights ago. She walked that corridor now, without altering her pace. She knocked once. The door opened. Veressa was dressed for travel. Not yet packed, the room still held her things in their places, but dressed in the layered, practical clothing of someone who has been mentally preparing departure for more than a day. She looked at Seraphine in the doorway, and she did the calculation that intelligent people do when they encounter something they hadn't planned for, and then her face settled into an expression that was almost, but not entirely, composed. "My Lady Queen," she said. "Lady Veressa." Seraphine came into the room without being invited. She looked at the traveling dress. "You're planning to leave today?" "I was considering the timing, yes. The timing." Seraphine walked to the window. The central garden was below, where the amber chambers had always been situated, overlooking the interior of the palace rather than the exterior walls. Excellent for observation, excellent for knowing the movement of everyone who used the garden paths as throughways, which was most of the ministry staff, most of the days. She turned. "Vort sent the confirmation signal this morning." The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. Veressa did not move, did not change her posture, did not make a sound, but something in the quality of the air in the chamber shifted the way air shifts when a fire changes its direction, subtle and total simultaneously. "She knows," Seraphine understood. "She has known since before I walked through this door. She was dressed for travel because she already knew something had gone wrong, which meant there was a communication channel Seraphine hadn't accounted for." "You have someone inside the garrison," Seraphine said. "Someone other than Vort. Someone who could send word independently." Veressa looked at her for a long moment, and then she did something that Seraphine had not anticipated. She sat down. She sat in the chair by the window in the amber afternoon light, and she looked at her hands in her lap, and she said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own form of answer. "You're not going to perform this," Seraphine said, almost to herself. "No," Veressa said quietly. "I don't think it would be useful." The honesty of it was its own form of intelligence. Veressa had assessed the situation the way she assessed all situations, with the cold pragmatism of a woman who had never confused sentiment with strategy. And she had determined that performance was not available to her, and that a certain kind of honesty might still be. Seraphine noted this and adjusted. "Who built this?" she said. "Lord Dune, or someone above him?" Veressa looked up. "My father does not have the patience for a plan this long." "Then someone gave him the plan. Someone gave him the resources." Veressa looked at the window. The plan was mine. The admission settled into the room with the weight of something falling from a great height. Seraphine stood very still. There are moments when the person you have been watching and calculating and defending against reveals themselves completely, and the completeness of the revelation is both exactly what you expected and still somehow more than you were prepared for. She had suspected Veressa was the architect. The intelligence of the execution had always pointed toward a single mind rather than a committee, but hearing it stated in that quiet, traveling dress voice, with the window light, making ordinary amber afternoon, around a woman who had come to Solmora with the intention of taking it. "You were never here for the king," Seraphine said. "He was useful," Veressa said. "His distraction was useful. His public conferral of credibility was useful." She paused. "He is a remarkable man. I want you to understand I was not lying about that." "You were lying about everything that mattered." "Yes," Veressa said simply. "That is accurate." Seraphine moved to the chair across from her and sat. She needed to think, and she needed information, and she needed Veressa to keep being honest. For as long as the honesty remained Veressa's best available option, which meant she needed to make Veressa believe the honesty had value. The second communication channel at Kale Crossing. Who carries it? I'm not going to tell you that. Because you're protecting them, or because you're protecting the contingency. Veressa met her eyes directly. Because it is the only piece of leverage I have remaining, and I have no reason to give it to you without knowing what use you intend to make of me. There it was. The negotiation. Even now, cornered in an amber chamber in a palace that had just finished understanding what she was, Veressa Dune was negotiating. Seraphine had to acknowledge the consistency of it. It was almost admirable in the way that watching any natural phenomenon operate exactly according to its nature was almost admirable, regardless of the damage it caused. "Phase 3, Seraphine said. 9 days. What moves?" Veressa was quiet. "Veressa." Seraphine's voice was very low and very clear. "There are 600 soldiers in a garrison that officially holds 400. There is a weapons inventory disguised as agricultural supply. There is a mobilization timeline. What moves in 9 days?" "The Northern Corridor," Veressa said. "A trade claim lodged simultaneously with 3 frontier houses, all of whom have been given documentation, fabricated documentation, indicating that Solmora ceded provisional authority over the Kale Crossing route in exchange for debt relief. Documentation that carries the ministerial stamps of 4 Solmoran officials who were not aware they were approving what they were approving." She paused. "When this claim is lodged and Solmora contests it, the documentation is presented as evidence of an imperial agreement. The frontier houses formally request the unregistered garrison as peacekeeping protection for the disputed route. At that point, the 600 soldiers are no longer an illegal force. They are treaty-recognized peacekeepers on disputed territory." The architecture of it opened in Seraphine's mind like a map unfolding. Not a military invasion, a legal one. An invasion of paperwork and precedent and manufactured imperial agreement that would create a territorial dispute complex enough to take years to unravel, during which time the Eastern Corridor, the one inactive route that connected Solmora's capital region to its northern frontier without crossing southern territory, would be under the practical control of the Dune houses and whoever was directing them. Brilliant, catastrophic, months from completion. And the Silvercrest presentation had been designed to create the exact crisis at the exact moment that would pull every ministry's attention toward palace drama and away from frontier administration. If Seraphine had been effectively sidelined, publicly humiliated enough that her influence in the ministry had contracted, no one would have gone to her with the treasury discrepancies. No one would have trusted her with the garrison intelligence. Brennan would have stayed quiet. Havit would have operated within official channels. The plan had not accounted for a queen who had already decided to rise before she was asked to. "The documents," Seraphine said, "the fabricated ministerial approvals. Where are the originals?" "I don't have them." "Where are they?" Veressa looked at the window. "If I tell you, I lose my leverage entirely. If you don't tell me, I have 9 days to find them without your help, and the process of finding them will be substantially less careful about what gets broken in the search." Seraphine held her gaze. "I am not a destructive person by nature, Lady Veressa, but I am capable of it when the alternative is worse." The silence between them was long. And then something happened in Varessa's face that Seraphine had not seen there before. Not defeat exactly. Something quieter than that. The specific settling that happens when a person who has been operating at the absolute limit of their capacity for a sustained period finally runs out of the energy required to maintain the structure they've built. Not surrender. Exhaustion. She was, Seraphine realized, very tired. This too was human. This was what got missed when you watched a person from the outside and cataloged only the intelligence and the ambition and the cold operational genius. You missed that intelligence and ambition and cold operational genius required an enormous amount of the person deploying them. And that person was flesh and blood and finite, and the finite always ran out eventually. Under Secretary Talon, Varessa said quietly. The documents are distributed across 3 locations, each requiring a separate authorization. Talon holds 1 key. The other 2 keys are held by people he believes are Solmoran ministerial allies, and who are actually mine. She looked at her hands. Talon doesn't know the full picture. He knows he's been moving stamps and adjusting records. He doesn't know why. He'll be frightened when I bring him in. He'll be terrified, Varessa agreed. He's not a brave man. That was why I chose him. Seraphine stood. She looked at Varessa Dune in the amber chair with the afternoon light making her ordinary, and the traveling dress making her intentions clear, and the exhaustion in her eyes making her for the first time look like the age she actually was. Which was young, Seraphine thought. She was young. This kind of plan, built with this kind of patience and this kind of cold brilliance, should have been the work of a middle-aged strategist with decades of accumulated bitterness. Varessa was perhaps 28. The thought was not warming. It was simply true, and truth had its own claim on acknowledgement regardless of whether it was convenient. You came here, Seraphine said, with a plan to take part of an empire, and almost everything about the plan was exactly right. Varessa looked up. Almost, Seraphine said. She left the amber chamber. What followed in the next 6 hours was the kind of work that happens in empires and never gets recorded in the histories that later generations read, because the histories prefer the battles and the speeches and the visible turning points. The invisible turning points, the ones made in corridors and offices and interrogation rooms with frightened bureaucrats, are what actually determine the shape of the battles and the speeches that follow. Talon broke in 20 minutes, not because Seraphine threatened him, though the space between them held the implication of consequences clearly enough. He broke because frightened men who have been carrying secrets that are larger than they understood have an almost physical need to put the weight down, and the moment someone authoritative walks into the room and makes it clear that the secret is already known, the carrying becomes pointless and the physical need overwhelms the fear. He told her where the documents were. He told her which ministerial allies of Varessa's held the authorization keys. He told her, unprompted, 3 additional things about the information management system that Marin Voss had installed in the ministerial layer. Things that filled gaps in Seraphine's understanding with the uncomfortable precision of pieces that had been waiting for their correct places all along. She had have it move on the 2 key holders simultaneously, quietly, before either of them could communicate with the other or with anyone at Kale Crossing. She had the documents in her hands by nightfall. She sat with them at the map table in the East Study and looked at them in the lamplight. The forged ministerial approvals were exceptionally good, not perfect. There were inconsistencies in the stamp pressure and one date notation that used a format that had been discontinued 18 months ago, but good enough to withstand casual scrutiny, which was all they had needed to withstand. The frontier houses receiving them would not have examined them closely. Frontier houses wanted the documentation to be real, and so they would have looked at it accordingly. Alaric stood across the table. He had been present through the latter half of the evening's work, not in the foreground but there, moving through the palace with the contained violence of a man who has understood the shape of what happened in his house while he was looking elsewhere, and is doing the specific private arithmetic of that understanding. She had seen him twice in 3 hours, and both times he had looked like a man who was not sleeping well and had no intention of sleeping soon. He looked at the documents on the table now. How close, he said. 9 days to Phase 3 activation. Less if the absence of the follow-up signal prompts an early move. She organized the documents into the sequence she intended to present to the council. But the plan required the documents to be presented simultaneously with the troop movement. Without the documents, the troops are just an unauthorized military presence on imperial territory, which is a very different legal situation than a peacekeeping force on disputed land. We have the documents. We have the documents. The silence held the weight of what that meant. Veressa, he said. Seraphine looked up. His voice on the name had changed again. It was not the tone of a man thinking about a woman who had understood him. It was the tone of a man thinking about a piece on a board that has revealed itself to be a different piece than he believed. She told me where to look, Seraphine said, when she understood the situation clearly. She cooperated. She negotiated. There is a difference. Seraphine held his gaze. She is intelligent enough to understand that the plan is finished, and that what comes next for her depends on what she is worth to us with the plan finished. That is not cooperation. That is optimization under constraint. He absorbed this. What do you intend to do with her? He said. This was not, she knew, entirely a tactical question. There was something personal in it that she could address or leave alone, and she chose to address it because leaving it alone would require pretending it wasn't there, and she had lost the appetite for pretending. Nothing, she said. Yet. She leaves Solmora with a clear accounting of what she attempted and what was stopped, and that accounting travels with her back to the southern houses, and the message it carries is specific. She set the documents flat. An alpha does not need to destroy what it defeats. Destruction is for the frightened. Demonstration is for the confident. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved through his face that was more complicated than any single word accommodated. You know, he said slowly, that every decision you have made in the past 4 days, every one, was the correct decision. I know. And you know that I was not making correct decisions. I know that too. He sat down across from her. He put his scarred hands flat on the table and he looked at them, and she recognized this posture. It was the posture of a man who is not managing toward an outcome, but simply sitting with what is true. She had not seen it from him in long enough that the recognition had the quality of something retrieved from storage. I don't know how to... He stopped. He started again. I have said things to you this year that I cannot take back. I made choices that... He stopped again. The sentence had nowhere to go that didn't require him to say something he had never said, which was that he had been wrong in a way that was not tactical, but personal, and that personal wrongness was the category he had the least practice with. She waited. I let her sit where you should have sat, he said finally, not in the councils, in the private hours. I brought her my fears instead of you, and I told myself it was because you were strong and didn't need... He exhaled through his nose. That was a lie. It was easier. She asked less of me than you do, because she didn't know me well enough to ask for the true version. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside the study window, the palace was fully dark. Seraphine looked at her alpha and felt something complicated and not entirely resolved, and decided that unresolved was appropriate for this moment, that the demand for resolution was itself a kind of impatience that the situation had not yet earned. There is a council in the morning, she said. The full council. What I found at Kale Crossing goes before every minister and every frontier lord's representative simultaneously, with the documentation and have its military assessment, and a unified response coordinated before anyone from the outside understands that the plan has been found. She held his gaze. I need you to convene that council. Done. And I need you to sit beside me and let me present it. He looked at her steadily. Of course, not as queen reporting to the king, she said, as partners, as what we were supposed to be and sometimes were, and what the empire will need us to be for what comes next. She held his gaze without apology and without softness, because this was not a soft moment, and she would not dress it as one. If you can't do that honestly, I need to know now, because I can run this myself. I have been running most of it myself. But if you are going to sit beside me in that council room tomorrow, you need to be fully beside me, and not adjacent to me in the way that you have been for most of this year. He sat with that for a long time. The lamp moved in a draft from the window seam. Seraphine, he said. His voice was rough in the way it got when he was done managing himself. I know what I did. I know what it cost. And I know that knowing it and naming it doesn't undo it. He looked at her directly. But I'm asking you, not as king, not as your alpha, as a man who has understood something painful and irreversible about himself tonight. I'm asking you to let me sit beside you tomorrow, genuinely beside you. She looked at him, and the thing that moved through her was not forgiveness, because forgiveness required more time and more honesty than a single night of crisis could purchase. What moved through her was something older than forgiveness. The recognition of a person she had loved under the person she had spent a year losing, like a signal through interference. She had not decided what to do with that recognition. She had not decided if it was enough. But the morning was coming, and the council was coming, and an empire needed to know what had been built inside it without its knowledge. And she had no time tonight for the most important conversation of her marriage. Then be ready before dawn, she said, because we don't have more than that. She gathered the documents and stood and walked toward the study door. She was 3 steps from it when the door opened from the outside. Prissa stood in the doorway. 2 days early. Her riding clothes were soaked to the collar. Her face was the color of cold stone. Her hands were empty. Seraphine's body understood before her mind did. Prissa, she said. Quiet. Controlled. Where is the ledger? Prissa's mouth opened. Something moved through her eyes that Seraphine had never seen there in 8 years. The specific devastation of a person who has failed at the one thing they were given to do and cannot find a frame large enough to hold the failure. They were waiting on the northern trace, Prissa said. 4 men. They took it. She swallowed. They knew which route. They knew what I was carrying. Her voice dropped. My lady. Someone told them. The room behind Seraphine went entirely silent. She stood in the doorway looking at her handmaid's empty hands, and she felt the shape of the new reality assembling itself around her with the cold precision of falling stone. Someone had told them. Someone who knew about the northern trace. Someone who knew Prissa was carrying the primary ledger. Someone who knew enough about Seraphine's operation in the past 4 days to predict the route and the timing and the cargo. She turned slowly. Havit was in the doorway of the adjacent passage. He had heard. His face was still. Alaric was standing at the map table. He had heard. His face had gone to the controlled blankness of a man receiving intelligence too serious to react to immediately. And between all of them hung the single question that had just rewritten the night entirely. The second communication channel at Kale Crossing, the one Veressa had not disclosed, the one she had kept as her final piece of leverage. Seraphine had understood it as a channel to receive information from the palace. She had not considered that it was also a channel to send it. She stood at the study door with the documents in her hands, the forged approvals, the evidence, the thing that made the difference between an invasion and a legal dispute. And she understood that the primary ledger was gone, and that without the ledger the garrison numbers were her word and Vort's testimony and nothing more, and that Vort was a frightened man alone at a frontier garrison, and frightened men alone at frontier garrisons could be reached before she could protect them. She had the documents. They had the ledger. And somewhere in the amber chambers, or already on the southern road, Veressa Dune had just demonstrated that she had never, for a single moment, stopped playing. Seraphine looked at Havit. How fast can you get soldiers to Vort? She said. Faster than they can, he said. If I move in the next hour. Move. He was gone before the word finished. She looked at Alaric. He was already on his feet, already at the door for the garrison communications office, already operating with the total focus of a man who had finally, completely, arrived at the only place that mattered. She stood alone in the study for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds to feel the full weight of what had just shifted. 4 seconds to acknowledge that the plan she had built carefully over 4 days had just cracked along its most important seam. 4 seconds to feel the fear, which was real and appropriate and did not serve her. Then she put the documents under her arm and walked back to the map table and sat down and pulled the northern frontier map toward her and began, for the 4th time in 4 days, to find the shape of a problem that had just changed its face. Because an empire does not wait for its queen to finish grieving. And a woman who has come this far does not stop at the moment when stopping would be easiest. The lamp burned. The map spread. Seraphine Vale, who had been built by sacrifice and tempered by betrayal and tested by the specific cruelty of being replaced in the only home she had ever made her own, looked at the lines of territory and responsibility and risk that constituted the empire she had helped build, and she made the only decision available to her. She would not play by the rules of a game designed for her to lose. She would change what the game was. Starting now. The map did not change no matter how long she stared at it. That was the particular cruelty of cartography. It showed you the ground as it had been measured, not as it currently was, and the gap between those two versions of the same territory was exactly where empires went to die. Seraphine looked at the northern trace routes. At the distance between Kale Crossing and the nearest Solmoran garrison that Havit could legally deploy without triggering the very legal dispute the Dune plan had been designed to manufacture. And she ran the numbers the way she had been running numbers for 4 days, and the numbers told her the same thing they had been telling her since Prisa walked through the door with empty hands. She was short, not by an unworkable amount, but short in the way that a bridge short by 3 feet is still a gap you cannot cross, because proximity to sufficient is not sufficient, and the Eastern Corridor was 9 days from a legal claim that would be substantially harder to contest without the primary ledger as evidentiary foundation. She had the forged documents. She had Talon's testimony, which was the confession of a frightened man, and therefore subject to the counterargument that frightened men say what the powerful want to hear. She had Vort, alone at a frontier garrison with 600 soldiers who were not his, and a communication channel she had not fully mapped. She had Varessa somewhere in this palace, having just demonstrated that she had been several moves ahead of every assumption Seraphine had made about how much leverage she actually held. What she did not have was time. She pulled the secondary trade route map toward her, the older one, predating the corridor reconstruction, showing the original network of supply roads before the ministry consolidated them. She had reviewed this map 3 years ago during a provincial budget dispute and had noted, in the way she noted everything that might someday matter, that 2 of the original routes still had active maintenance contracts that someone in the lower ministry was quietly funding without attaching them to any current operational purpose. Funded maintenance on inactive roads. She had assumed bureaucratic inertia at the time. She looked at those routes now with different eyes. The roads ran northeast of the main corridor, narrower than the primary route, not wide enough for heavy supply wagons or large troop formations moving in column, but wide enough for fast riders moving in small groups, and they connected through a series of village transfer points to the northeastern garrison, where Lord Fennec commanded 800 soldiers loyal to the crown rather than to any particular face wearing the crown, which was the most important kind of loyalty when everything else was in motion. She had written Fennec 3 days ago. No response yet. She went to find Darrett. He was in the trade office annex, a man of 40-something with a horseman's build and the kind of face that forgot itself immediately in any crowd. He looked up when she entered and stood before she said a word. "The old northeastern trace," she said, "through the Vesson transfer points. How fast can you reach Fennec's garrison?" "On the relay horses, before noon tomorrow." "I need Fennec to move to the Kale Approach Road. Parallel, 3 miles north of the official route, in position before dawn the day after tomorrow, without filing a garrison deployment record until he's already in position." Darrett looked at her for exactly the time required to understand what she was asking. "Is this sanctioned by the king?" "It will be," she said, "by the time you're halfway there." He moved to get his coat. "Darrett." He stopped. The network that took the ledger knew the route and the timing within hours. Move as if you're going off duty. Buy something from the eastern market before you leave the city. Don't take the trade office horses. He nodded once. No questions. He left through the side passage. She went back to the study. Alaric was in the garrison communications room when she found him, standing over a duty officer encoding a message to the Northern Command with the specific intensity of a king who has remembered, after a period of forgetting, exactly what he was built for. He looked up when she entered. "Havit's moving," he said. "First company, 40 riders, out the eastern gate 12 minutes ago. I need you to sanction a garrison deployment for Fennec. Already done. I sent the order an hour ago. Direct, not through the ministerial layer." His jaw was set. "You weren't the only one reading the provincial records, Seraphine. I was slow. I wasn't absent." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Fennec needs to approach parallel, 3 miles north. That's exactly what I ordered." The gap between them held something that was not warmth yet, but was the adjacent thing. 2 minds properly synchronized, moving faster than either mind alone. She had forgotten what that felt like. She had been trying not to remember, because remembering it while it was absent had been its own specific grief. She let herself remember it now, just briefly. Then she moved on. "There's something else," she said. The ledger intercept happened too fast. Prisa left the garrison before dawn. The ambush was waiting on the northern trace before midday. 6 hours to receive information from Kyle Crossing, plan an interception, position 4 men on the correct road. That's not a response. That's prepared in advance. Alaric looked at the map. They knew there was a risk the ledger would be found. They had a contingency for it, which means the ledger itself may be part of the plan, something they were prepared to lose if necessary, because without it, the garrison numbers are our word versus theirs. But the forged ministerial documents, those are the mechanism. Without them, the Phase 3 legal claim has no foundation. It's just an unauthorized military presence on contested territory. With them, it becomes an imperial precedent dispute that takes 3 years to unravel. She met his eyes. And we have them. That's why Veressa told me where to find them. He went still. She told you where the documents were, he said slowly, because she wanted us to have them. She told us because she had already secured the one piece of evidence that gives them context. Without the ledger, documents we produce look like forgeries we manufactured ourselves. If the frontier houses present the forged approvals and we contest them with the same documents, we need the ledger to establish that the same network created both the garrison and the paperwork. One without the other is a dispute between empires, and those favor whoever controls the territory in question. She is still playing, Alaric said. She never stopped. His hands flattened on the communication table. The scar on his left thumb went pale. She watched him process it. The realization that the woman he had brought into his emotional confidence, whose intelligence he had praised before every assembled house in Solmora, had been executing a plan against this empire for longer than he had known she existed. There is a particular wound available to powerful men in this specific moment. Not ordinary betrayal. Something worse. The pain of having opened the door yourself, escorted the threat to the center of your own defenses, conferred public legitimacy upon it with a silver crest in a lit hall. To be deceived is one thing. To have been the instrument of your own deceiving is a category of damage that pride does not absorb easily and should not. Some wounds need to be felt at full weight or they teach nothing. She let him carry it without softening it. I'm going to the frontier lords, she said, directly, before the southern network reaches them. Take the royal guard. A queen arriving at a frontier estate with royal guard before dawn is a siege. I arrive as myself, with 2 outriders and the documents. That is a conversation. He looked at her for a long moment. If something goes wrong on that road, then you have the documents, have its riders at Kale Crossing, and Fennec in position. The Empire survives. She held his gaze. The Empire survived before me. I know it can survive without you, he said quietly. That isn't what I'm asking. She held his gaze and chose not to answer. Not from cruelty. From self-preservation of the specific kind a woman learns when she has loved something completely and watched it nearly break her. The preservation of distance required to keep thinking clearly. When thinking clearly was the only thing standing between an empire and its ruin. Have the council ready for when I return, she said. Full assembly. Every minister, every frontier representative in the capital. She separated the documents into 2 groups. Kept the originals. Gave him the forgeries. Guard those as the only copies, she said, because as far as Veressa's network knows, they are. She walked out. The eastern road before dawn had a quality it lacked in daylight. Stripped-down honesty, the landscape visible only where her outriders' torches reached, everything beyond existing in solid black. She had always found something clarifying about travel at this hour. The palace fell away. The performance of it, the weight of watching and being watched, the constant calculation of how every movement would be read, all of it stayed behind the city gate. Out here it was just the road and the cold and the work ahead, she thought, writing, about what it means to reach the point of no longer needing the outcome to go a particular way in order to remain yourself. It sounds like freedom until you actually arrive there, and then it feels like what it actually is. The scar tissue of having cared so completely about something that losing pieces of it became survivable. Survivable things always leave marks. The marks were not weakness. They were the record of what had been withstood and what had been learned on the other side of withstanding it. An alpha's greatest danger, she had come to understand, is not external. It is the specific blindness that sustained power performs on perception. A person who has been the gravitational center of every room they enter for 17 years stops being able to read those rooms objectively because everyone in them is always oriented toward them. They become simultaneously the measuring instrument and the thing being measured. Alaric was not a foolish man. He was a man deformed by his own authority, and Veressa had understood this with the surgical precision of a strategist who had studied her target long before she arrived. She had not come to seduce a king. She had come to exploit the specific loneliness that power creates in the people it crowns. the longing to be seen without the crown, understood without the history, admired without the weight of being known accurately. She had offered Alaric the intoxicating simplicity of a person who had no record of his failures and no standing to demand his honesty. Clean, without cost. It was always going to be the more immediately seductive option. Understanding it did not make the wound smaller, but it gave the wound a shape Seraphine could work with, which was all she had ever asked of her pain. Lord Cassin's estate announced itself through timber smoke before the structure became visible, a working estate built for weather rather than impression. She approved of both. He came to the gate himself, broad and sleep-roughened, and he looked at her on her horse in the torchlight with the recalibration of a man who has a document in his home that suddenly requires reconsideration. She asked for a table. He opened the gate. The hour became 2. She laid both documents flat, the forged approval he had received 3 weeks ago, and the original ministerial record showing Solmora's actual position on Kale Crossing. She showed him the stamp inconsistency. The date notation format discontinued 18 months prior. She explained without drama what the documents were designed to accomplish and what position his name would occupy if the territorial claim moved forward on its manufactured foundation. He asked 3 questions. They were good questions, specific, practical, aimed at the gaps in her presentation. She answered directly. Where she lacked the complete answer, she said so. That mattered to him. She had counted on it mattering. At the end of the second hour, he poured something dark and locally made and pushed a cup across to her without ceremony. Someone used my name, he said. Not a question. The gathering fury of a man deciding which direction to point it. On a document manufactured to look like your endorsement of an imperial agreement that does not exist, she said, I want that recorded in the council notes. It will be the first thing I enter. He looked at her across the table with the assessment of a man who has spent his life in territory that does not reward sentiment. You came yourself, before dawn, not a courier. This was not a message to be trusted to someone else. He studied her a moment longer. Then he said something she had not expected. I voted against the silver crest in my head. Didn't say it because you don't say that to a king in his own hall. He paused. It wasn't right. She held his gaze. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold more precisely. She left with his written withdrawal and a sealed letter to the second frontier lord. The second conversation was shorter because she arrived with Cassin's letter already on the table, and Lord Renwald was a man who read situations by reading who else had already read them. Cassin's decision was the most important piece of information she'd brought. He signed within the hour. The third lord was the problem she had known he would be. Lord Adric of the southern boundary was younger than the others, more ambitious, and not simply a name on a manufactured document. He had been an active correspondent with Marin Voss for 6 months, with a level of detail indicating genuine participation. She knew this from Talon's testimony and from 2 letters in the document set bearing Adric's seal on correspondence that would incriminate him the moment she placed it in front of him. This conversation was not going to be bitter cups in 2 hours. He kept her waiting in the courtyard for 20 minutes. He received her in the formal hall with 2 senior men flanking him. By the time she sat across from him, she understood he had known she was coming and had decided the shape of the conversation before she arrived. There was still a channel she hadn't mapped. My Lady Queen, he said, traveling early. Lord Adric. She set the document case on the table. I'll be direct. Please, you know why I'm here. So we can spend time establishing that you knew nothing, and I can spend time contradicting that, or we can begin where this conversation actually starts, which is what happens next. She held his gaze without softening it. Lord Cassin has withdrawn. Lord Renwald has withdrawn, which leaves your name as the sole frontier authority attached to a claim built on forged documents, an unauthorized garrison, and a network whose central architect is currently a guest of the Solmoran Palace. She paused. I want to understand what you believe your position looks like in 9 days when Phase 3 activates under those conditions. He worked through his responses. She watched them cross his face in sequence: resistance, calculation, the particular mathematics of a man measuring his options against his exposure. What are you offering? He said finally. The opportunity to step back before this becomes something that requires you to be made an example of. Her voice stayed even. Not warm, not cold, the tone of function rather than feeling. I am not here to destroy you. An empire that unmakes every lord who was maneuvered into conspiracy has fewer lords, and fewer lords means more territory to govern without the local knowledge required to govern it. I'm a practical person. And if I don't step back, she looked at him. There is a kind of look that requires no additional language. It communicates through complete certainty, the expression of a person who has already lived past this moment in their mind and knows exactly what occupies the space on the other side. Seraphine had not known she possessed this look until recently. She suspected it only became available after a person had been through enough genuine loss to have nothing left to protect, and had survived it, and had discovered in surviving it that they were made of something more durable than the things that had been taken from them. Then in 9 days, when Phase 3 fails because the garrison has been secured and the documentation presented to full Imperial Council with the forgeries alongside the originals and 2 Frontier Lords' withdrawals already on record, she said, you will be the only name remaining attached to an operation whose architect is in Solmora custody and whose legal foundation has been publicly dismantled. Your estate sits on the southern boundary. Lord Dune's trade network runs your eastern border. After this, it will not run anywhere. Solmora can reach, and Solmora's reach is about to extend substantially beyond what certain ministers have been allowing it. She let that settle. How does your estate function without that corridor? The 2 flanking men had stopped watching Adric. He pulled the document case toward him, opened it, looked at the documents for a long time, then looked up at her with the expression she had been waiting for. Not capitulation, not fear, but the specific recognition of a man who has understood that the person across from him is not performing and is not going to be moved, and that fighting this particular reality costs more than adjusting to it. I'll need assurances in writing, he said. You'll have a letter in my hand before you leave this chair. Your written withdrawal before I leave your hall. He looked at his 2 men. Leave us. They left. He picked up his pen. Then he said, the woman, Veressa. She told us you would come. He paused. Something in his face was revising something he had believed. She said if the plan was disrupted at the capital end, the queen would come herself. He looked at the documents. She said you were the only person in Solmora worth being afraid of. The hall held that sentence. Seraphine pulled a blank page from the document case and began drafting his assurance letter in the plain, direct language of someone who intends every word to be exactly what it says. Her hand was steady. It had found its steadiness in Cassine's working room 2 hours before dawn and had not left her since. The particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having moved through it so many times that fear has been reclassified from obstacle to information. She finished. She passed it across. He read it. He picked up his pen. He was halfway through his signature when the door opened. A rider, dust-covered, breathing hard, with the look of someone who had ridden through the night and arrived with something that could not wait. He looked at Adric. Then his eyes found Seraphine, and the calculation on his face was immediate and visible. He had expected a lord alone and found a queen instead, and the divergence between those 2 realities was going to cost someone something. My lord, he said to Adric, word from Kale Crossing. The room changed. Speak, Seraphine said. Her voice carried the weight of every midnight map and every provincial record and every conversation held while palaces slept and conspiracies breathed. It required no other backing. The writer looked at Adric. Adric looked at the writer. Then at the queen across his table. Then at his pen, halfway through his signature, the withdrawal half complete. He was still, technically, a man with options. For 3 more seconds. Speak, she said again. The writer straightened. The garrison at Kale Crossing, he said. It's moving, not in 9 days, now, all of them. 600, north along the corridor. They started at midnight. Midnight. Before Havit's riders could have reached the garrison. Before Fennec's parallel approach could be in position. Before any of the frontier lords had formally stepped back. At midnight, someone had sent the order to advance Phase 3 by 9 days. The second channel. The one Veressa had not disclosed. Not just a channel to receive information from the palace, a channel to send it. The moment the Amber Chamber conversation ended and Seraphine walked out with the documents, Veressa had sent a single signal through the unmapped line, and Kale Crossing had moved. Not into the careful legal architecture that required documents and frontier endorsements and 9 days of sequence. Just moved. 600 unauthorized soldiers pushing north along an inactive imperial corridor, forcing the one outcome the plan had spent months engineering around: open, undeniable, illegal military presence in Solmoran territory, without the legal framework to make it anything other than invasion. The plan had failed, so Varessa had activated the war. Seraphine sat with the full weight of that for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds to feel it completely. The cold drop of understanding, the realization that the intelligence she had been matching for 5 days had been, at its deepest layer, more prepared for failure than she had accounted for. 3 seconds of honest acknowledgement that she had been outplayed at the final move. Then she put it down. Because 3 seconds was all she could afford, and she had work to do. She looked at Lord Adric. His pen was still on the paper. Signature half finished. The writer's news had given him back his options, or made him believe it had, which was the same thing for the next 60 seconds. And 60 seconds was all Varessa's contingency needed to make this conversation collapse. 600 soldiers moving north changed the shape of every calculation in this room. It told Adric that the plan was not finished, only changed, that the force existed and was moving regardless of the legal architecture, and that perhaps aligning with a moving force was safer than stepping back from it. This was the calculation Varessa had made for him. She had understood, even in the amber chamber with her last leverage stripped away, that the military move would reach Adric before Seraphine could complete her signature, and that the news of it would make him reconsider the pen in his hand. Brilliant. Even now, even losing. Seraphine looked at him, and she understood something that clarified everything. Varessa's greatest weapon had never been the plan. Plans failed, documents were found, networks were dismantled. Her greatest weapon was the ability to make every person in any given room believe that she had already accounted for this exact moment, and that resistance was therefore futile. The aura of the inevitable. The performance of someone who has already won and is simply allowing the other players to arrive at that understanding in their own time. It was the same weapon she had used on Alaric. The feeling of being seen by someone who had already understood where this was going. And it only worked if you believed it. Seraphine looked at Adric, and she made a decision about what the next sentence was going to be. And the decision came not from strategy, but from something older and less calculated. The bedrock understanding of a woman who had built 9 years of invisible architecture and watched it hold when visible architecture failed. And who knew, with the specific certainty of someone who has done the actual work rather than performed it, what her empire was built of and what it could bear. "Lord Adric," she said. Her voice was exactly level. 600 soldiers moving without imperial authorization, without the legal framework that was supposed to legitimize them, into territory that 2 other frontier lords have just formally confirmed they are not party to. Those are not peacekeepers on disputed land. Those are armed men in violation of imperial sovereignty. And the response to armed men in violation of imperial sovereignty is not a legal dispute. She held his gaze. It is general habit. Adric looked at her. "Havit has 40 riders already moving toward that garrison," she said. "Fennec has 800 soldiers parallel to the approach road. The difference between a territorial negotiation and a military suppression is the signature on that page." She nodded toward the half-finished withdrawal. A territorial negotiation can be survived. It can be stepped back from. It can be recorded as a misunderstanding built on fraudulent documentation that deceived an otherwise loyal frontier lord. She paused. What follows a military suppression cannot be stepped back from, for anyone whose name is attached to the force being suppressed. The room was absolutely still. The writer had stopped breathing audibly. Adric looked at the pen in his hand. He looked at the half-finished signature. He looked at the Queen of Solmora sitting across his table in travel-worn clothes with steady hands, and the expression of a woman who has not slept properly in 5 days and has not once, in those 5 days, stopped moving toward the thing she was moving toward. And then he finished his signature. The pen came off the page. He pushed the document across to her. She took it. She stood. She picked up the document case and the 3 withdrawal letters, and she looked at Lord Adric one final time with the look of a woman who has just closed the last account that needed closing before the real work began. "Get your household inside the estate walls," she said. "Keep them there until you receive word from the capital." Then she turned to her outriders at the hall door. "Ride," she said. And the word came out the way a word comes out, when a person has been moving toward a single moment for 5 days and has finally arrived at the threshold of it. Not loud, not dramatic, just completely certain. The sound of someone who has already decided and needs only the ground beneath their feet to confirm the direction. She had 3 withdrawal letters. She had the original documents. She had Have It moving, Fennec in position, and an empire that did not yet know it was ours from the most direct confrontation it had faced since the wars that built it. And 600 soldiers on a corridor road who had been sent into motion by a woman sitting in an amber chamber in Solmora's palace, having calculated that the chaos of premature movement was more survivable than the certainty of a plan fully dismantled. Veressa was not wrong about the chaos. She had simply made one error in the calculation. She had sent the order before she knew which direction Adric would fall. Seraphine had the withdrawal. She swung into the saddle and felt the horse move under her, and she looked north along the road toward a corridor where 600 unauthorized soldiers were moving in the dark toward a confrontation they believed was still invisible. And she thought one clear thought before the speed of the ride took over, and thinking gave way to the pure, focused forward motion of a woman who has run out of room for anything except what comes next. They had moved the war up 9 days because they believed she hadn't finished yet. They were wrong. She had finished. Now she was coming home to end it. She rode through the morning with the 3 withdrawal letters inside her coat, and the cold against her face, and the sound of hooves on stone that had cracked 2 winters ago and not been repaired. And she thought about nothing except the road ahead, because the road ahead was all there was room for now. The capital's gate came into view at midday. It looked the same as it had every time she'd ridden back through it. The twin wolves on the banners, the gold thread in the black silk, the guards who recognized her and opened without ceremony. But she was not the same woman who had ridden out 5 days ago, and she understood that the gate does not change, but the person passing through it always does. And the distance between those 2 facts is the entire story of what it costs to survive something genuinely difficult. She did not go to her chambers. She went directly to the East Study, where Alaric was standing at the map table with Havit on one side and Brennan on the other. And the quality of tension in the room was the specific tension of men who have been managing a crisis in real time and are waiting for a piece of information that changes what the managing looks like. She put the 3 withdrawal letters on the table without preamble. Alaric looked at them. He looked at her face. Something moved through his expression that she did not have a clean word for. Relief, and something deeper than relief. The particular quality of a man who has been watching a person he underestimated demonstrate, in real time and at genuine personal cost, the full dimension of what they are. Adric, he said, signed before the rider's news reached the hall. Barely. She pulled off her riding gloves. The garrison moved at midnight. 600 north along the corridor. Havit, already engaged, Havit said. His voice carried the flat precision of a soldier reporting, rather than narrating. My 40 riders made contact with the garrison's advance units at the 3rd border marker 2 hours ago. They stopped. The advance units are holding position. They were not expecting armed Solmoran response, which means they were told the capital end was still operational. He paused. They are waiting for orders. Orders that won't come from the capital end, Seraphine said, because the capital end is finished. Fennec's 800 are parallel to the approach from the north, Havit continued. The garrison is effectively boxed. 600 men in a corridor with Solmoran forces on 2 sides and no legal framework remaining to make their presence anything other than trespass. The mathematics of the situation had inverted overnight. 24 hours ago, Veressa's contingency had looked like a forced move that might still salvage something from a failing plan. Now in the flat morning light of the East Study with 3 withdrawal letters on the table and every ministry document exposing the fraud sitting in organized sequence beside the map, the garrison's advance looked like what it was, a panicked forward lurch by a plan that had already been outmaneuvered at every other position. The most dangerous moment in any system is not the crisis itself, but the period just before it when everyone is still pretending the ground is stable. Seraphine's father had told her that. She had spent 5 days watching it prove itself true, watching the courtesy of collapse, maintain its performance right up until the moment it couldn't anymore. The courtesy was finished. Vort, she said. Secured, Havit said. My riders reached him 4 hours ago. He is cooperative. She nodded. Frightened men in frontier garrisons cooperated when Solmoran cavalry arrived before the people they were frightened of. This had been the race she'd been running since Prisa walked through the door with empty hands, and the race was done. Send the order to the advance units, she said. Stand down and return to garrison under Solmoran escort, not as prisoners. As a garrison that was given unauthorized orders and is now receiving correct ones, the distinction matters for what comes after. She looked at Havit. The men in that corridor are not the architects of this. They are hired soldiers who are paid to be somewhere and were not told the full picture of what somewhere meant. How they are treated in the next 12 hours will determine whether the frontier hears that Solmora handles its crises with authority or with cruelty. We want authority. Havit looked at her for a moment with the expression he reserved for things he considered correct. Yes, my lady. He left. Brennan exhaled slowly, the long exhale of a man who has been holding something for days and has finally been given permission to put it down. He gathered the financial documents from the table with careful hands and asked quietly if the council assembly was still required for the full ministerial presentation. Tomorrow morning, Seraphine said. Everything on record. Every document, every testimony, every gap in the ministerial layer. Full transparency to every house in Solmora. He nodded and left. And then it was just the two of them in the e-study and the map on the table between them and the quiet that follows the specific kind of sustained effort that has been operating without pause for long enough that its cessation feels like a physical change in air pressure. Alaric looked at her for a long time. She let him look. There is something that happens between two people who have been through a genuine crisis together. Not a performed crisis, not a managed inconvenience, but the kind that requires everything available and still barely holds. And the something is not resolution exactly. It is recognition. The acknowledgement that both people were present for something real and that the reality of it has changed the shape of what stands between them. Veressa, she said finally, still in the amber chambers. His voice was even. Waiting. She'll know by now that the garrison stopped. She knew before the garrison stopped, he said. I think she has been watching all of this the way a chess player watches the endgame. Not with hope of winning, with the particular attention of someone who wants to understand how they lost. Seraphine thought about that. She thought about Veressa in the amber chair with the afternoon light making her ordinary and the exhaustion in her eyes making her young. She thought about a woman who had built something extraordinary and had built it against the wrong opponent, or rather, had built it correctly against every opponent except the one she hadn't fully accounted for, which was a queen who had been pushed toward her own edge and had looked down and decided that falling was not the same as failing. I'll speak with her, Seraphine said. Seraphine, it isn't about her. She met his eyes. It's about what I need to say. The amber chambers were exactly as they had been. The traveling dress, the afternoon light, the chair by the window. Veressa looked up when Seraphine entered, and she did not perform surprise and she did not perform composure. She simply looked at her with the direct, stripped quality of a person who has arrived at the end of a very long effort and has set the effort down. Seraphine sat across from her. They looked at each other. The garrison stopped, Veressa said. An hour ago. Veressa nodded slowly. She looked at the window. Outside, the central garden moved in a small wind, the winter bare branches making their sparse gestures against the pale sky. I built that plan for 3 years, she said. It was not complaint. It was accounting. The straightforward ledger entry of a person reviewing what they spent. I know, Seraphine said. Your father's secondary route maps. A ghost of something crossed Veressa's face. I didn't account for those. I thought the old northeastern trace was abandoned completely. She paused. I should have verified. Yes, Seraphina agreed. You moved faster than I calculated. I had less to lose than you planned for. Seraphine held her gaze steadily. You built the plan around a queen who was being displaced, a woman whose influence was contracting, whose credibility was being publicly eroded, who was operating from a defensive position inside a palace where her own king had begun looking elsewhere. She paused. That queen existed for about 4 months. Then she stopped existing. Veressa looked at her for a long moment. When? When I went to the East Study and opened the provincial records. Seraphine's voice was quiet and direct. When I stopped waiting to be restored and started deciding what I actually was without the restoration. She met Veressa's eyes. You planned against the version of me that needed Alaric to choose me in order to function. That version would have been manageable. The version that decided she didn't need the choosing. That one you didn't have a plan for. The room was very still. No, Veressa said. I didn't. And in those 3 words was the most honest thing she had said since the amber chair conversation. the clean acknowledgement of a strategist who has been defeated by the one variable she underweighted and who is precise enough in her own assessment to name it accurately. There is a particular kind of respect available between adversaries who have tested each other completely and reached the end of the contest with their intellectual honesty intact. It is not warmth. It is not forgiveness. It is the acknowledgement that the contest was real and the outcome was earned by both parties, the winner through what they did and the loser through what they revealed about the limits of their own vision. Seraphine felt something close to that now. She had not expected to. "You will leave Solmora," she said, "today, with escort to the southern border. Your father's trade network will be restructured under Solmoran ministerial oversight for a period of no less than 3 years. The documentation of what was attempted will be preserved in full, not published, but preserved, which means it exists, and you know it exists, and that fact is its own form of accountability." She held Varessa's gaze. "You will not be tried. You will not be publicly destroyed. Not because what you did was survivable for the people it was done to, but because destroying you publicly requires making this story the Empire's story for the next 2 years, and I have better uses for those 2 years." Varessa looked at her. "You're not doing this for me," she said. "No," Seraphine agreed. "I'm doing it for Solmora." A long silence. Then Varessa said something that Seraphine had not expected and would think about for a long time afterward. She said it quietly, without performance, in the voice of a woman who has nothing left to manage and has arrived, perhaps for the first time in years, at something simply true. "I wanted to build something," Varessa said. "Something that was mine. Something that couldn't be taken from me because I had taken it myself." She looked at her hands. "I chose the wrong method. I knew that and I chose it anyway because I was better at that method than any other." She paused. "That is not an excuse. It is an explanation of the kind of person I am, which is the kind of person who should not be left near the center of things." Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. "What you wanted," she said carefully, "was not wrong. Building something that cannot be taken from you. Building something that is yours by right of effort rather than proximity." She held the younger woman's gaze with the direct, unsparing attention of someone offering something real rather than something comfortable. The method was wrong. The want was not. She stood. "I hope you find a version of it that doesn't require burning other people's architecture to construct your own." She left the amber chambers. She did not look back. The council met the following morning. Every minister, every frontier lord's representative in the capital. The full assembly of Solmora's governing structure gathered in the long granite room with the maps pinned to the table and the documents laid in sequence, and the evidence of what had been built inside the Empire's own walls presented without theater and without mercy. Seraphine stood at the map table and presented it. Not Alaric, not Havit, her. She had spent 9 years in this room offering pieces of things. A strategic suggestion here, a fiscal analysis there. The careful incremental contribution of a woman who understood that queens and councils were tolerated rather than expected. She had operated within the tolerance, working the system from inside its constraints. She was done with the inside of constraints. She presented the full account from beginning to end. The information management system installed in the ministerial layer, the fraudulent documents, the garrison at Kale Crossing, the timeline, the frontier lords' involvement and their withdrawal. The network of supply falsifications and census manipulations that had been quietly bleeding the eastern provinces for the better part of a year. She presented it the way she had always worked, with precision, with documentation, with the absolute refusal to claim more than the evidence supported, and the equal refusal to claim less. The room was silent throughout, not the polite silence of people performing attention. The genuine silence of people who are understanding, in real time, the gap between what they believed they knew and what they actually knew, and measuring the size of that gap with the discomfort of those who have been made to see their own blindness clearly. Lord Brennan looked at the financial documents with the expression of a man who is reviewing his own record and finding it wanting in ways he hadn't fully acknowledged. General Havit sat with his scarred jaw set and his hands flat on the table and said nothing, because he had known the largest pieces of this for days, and had trusted her to bring it to the room correctly, and she had. The Frontier Lord's representatives looked at the 3 withdrawal letters from Cassine, Renwald, and Adric, and understood what it had taken to obtain all 3, and in the understanding was a quality of recalibration visible even across the length of the long table. And Alaric sat at the head of the table and watched his queen stand before the assembled power of his empire and present the intelligence that had saved it, and his face held the expression of a man doing the most important accounting of his life, which was not financial and was not military, but was the private ledger of what he had allowed and what it had cost, and what was now required of him. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Lord Cassine, who had come down from his estate for the assembly, and who sat near the front with the weathered directness of a man who has already decided what he thinks, said, "What does the Queen recommend for the ministerial restructuring? Not what does the King recommend. What does the Queen recommend?" Seraphine held the room's attention for a moment. Then she told them. That evening, after the council had adjourned and the ministers had dispersed with their assignments and the work of restructuring had begun its long and unglamorous process, Seraphine went to the garden. Not the central garden overlooked by amber chambers. The one at the eastern wing, the frozen garden that their chambers overlooked. The one she had looked down at on the worst night of the year when Alaric had stood in their room and insisted that nothing dishonorable had happened, and she had answered that a heart betrays daily. That garden. The one that had witnessed the worst of it, which made it the correct place for whatever came next. She heard him behind her, his footsteps on the stone path, the particular weight and cadence of them, unchanged in 9 years. She had always been able to identify his approach by sound alone. She wondered if he knew that. She had never told him. He came to stand beside her, not close, not the careful distance of recent months either, somewhere in between. The distance of two people who are trying to find each other again across a gap that is real and acknowledged and has not been pretended away. They stood for a while without speaking. The garden was silver in the evening light. The bare branches of the winter trees made their sparse geometry against a sky going dark at the edges. Somewhere in the city below, Solmora was moving through its evening routines, markets closing, fires being lit, the ordinary persistence of life inside an empire that had come closer to fracturing than most of its inhabitants would ever know. This was the thing about the work Seraphine had always done. It was invisible. The crises averted left no visible scar. The disasters that did not happen had no monument. You could spend a lifetime holding something together, and the only evidence of the holding was the thing still standing, and the thing still standing was taken, by most observers, as evidence that nothing had ever threatened it. She had spent 9 years being the evidence that nothing had ever threatened it. She was tired of being invisible architecture. "The council," Alaric said finally. "I know. That wasn't... I have sat beside generals after battle, ministers after crises, frontier lords after campaigns that determined whether their territories survived." He paused. "I have never watched anyone do what you did in that room today." She looked at the garden. Seraphine, her name in his voice. The music fully returned, rough at the edges with something that had been carried for a long time. "I owe you an accounting. Alaric, let me say it." He turned toward her. She could see him in her peripheral vision. The scarred hands, the chain of office removed again, the face of the man who existed under the king. "I made choices this year that I told myself were not choices. I told myself I was simply existing in a situation, responding to what was in front of me. I didn't choose to seek her out. I didn't choose to trust her. I simply found myself doing it, and I told myself that passivity absolved me of the responsibility." He stopped. "That was a lie I told myself because the alternative required me to look at what I had been doing to you, specifically, and I wasn't ready to do that. But..." She looked at the bare branches. "You came to me with provincial records," he continued. "You came to me with your analysis of the Eastern Corridor. You came to me with fiscal reports and diplomatic assessments, and the accumulated work of someone who was trying, in every way she could find, to remain genuinely useful to a marriage that was stopping seeing her." He exhaled. "And I thanked you for it and moved on. I gave to her what I should have been giving back to you. I don't mean the political currency. I mean the attention, the private hours, the willingness to be known." He paused. "I withheld that from you, and I told myself it was because you were strong enough not to need it. That was the cruelest thing I did, because it let me pretend that what I was withholding wasn't worth anything." The garden held the silence. She turned toward him. His face in the evening light looked like what it was, a man at the end of a long and honest accounting, with nothing left to protect his ego from the results. There is a kind of strength that most people mistake for hardness. It is the strength that does not announce itself, that does not require validation or witness, that builds in the dark and in the quiet and in the provincial records at midnight and on the road before dawn, and it does not need anyone to see it in order to exist. Seraphine had found that strength in the East study, and it had cost her more than anything she had ever built, because finding it had required losing things she had genuinely loved. She was not who she had been at the beginning of this year. She would not pretend otherwise, and she would not mourn it. The person she had been was not equipped for what this year had required. The person she was now had been built by that requirement, and the building had been painful, and the result was something she had not asked for and could not now imagine being without. "I'm not the same," she said. "I know. What happened this year, what I lost and what I found, I can't go back to before it. I don't want to. The version of me that needed you to choose me in order to feel real." She held his gaze. "She's gone. I don't grieve her, but I need you to understand that what I'm offering you, if I'm offering it, is not a restoration of what we were." He looked at her steadily. "Then what is it?" he said. "Something harder," she said. "Something that requires both of us to be honest in ways that are less comfortable than what we had before. Because what we had before had comfort in it that was actually avoidance." She held his gaze without softening it. "I know you now in a way I didn't before this year. I know where your blindness lives. I know the specific ways that power has deformed your perception without your awareness. I know what you do when you are lonely and unwilling to admit it." She paused. "And you know now that I am not a wall. I am a person who built a wall because the alternative was bleeding out in a palace while everyone watched and called it composure." She let that settle. "If you can work with what we both actually are, not the versions of each other we prefer, but the true and complete and sometimes inconvenient versions, then I am willing to try to build something real." He looked at her for a long time. The darkness was full now. The garden had gone to shadow and silver, the city's lights coming on below, Solmora breathing its evening breath. "Seraphine," he said, "I would spend the rest of my life learning to be worth what you just said." She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, the thing she felt when she looked at him was not grief, was not the managed distance of a woman protecting her last resources, was not the cold clarity of an adversary in a house that had begun to feel like enemy territory. It was something older than all of those, something that had not died in the East study or on the road to Cassine's estate or in the amber chamber with Veressa, something that had been present through all of it, quietly, like the maintenance funding on inactive roads, apparently abandoned, actually tended, waiting for the moment when it would be needed again. She did not tell him what she felt. Not yet. Some things needed more time than a garden at dusk could hold. But she did not move away. And he did not misread the stain. 3 days later, Veressa Dune left Solmora through the southern gate with an escort of 6 Solmoran riders and no ceremony. She sat her horse with the particular posture of a woman who has decided that dignity is the only remaining form of victory available and has accepted the limitation. She did not look back at the palace as she rode. Seraphine watched from the window of the East study, not from satisfaction, not from triumph, from the straightforward acknowledgement that something had ended and that the ending needed a witness, and she was the correct witness for it. She thought about what Veressa had said in the amber chair. "I wanted to build something that was mine." The want was recognizable. The want was, in some form, the same want that had sent Seraphine to the provincial records at midnight, that had put her on the road to the frontier lords before dawn, that had made her walk into Cassine's working room and Adric's formal hall and the amber chambers and the council chamber and stand in each of them fully and without apology. The difference was not the want. The difference was what you were willing to do to the people around you in order to satisfy it. Seraphine had chosen not to destroy to build. She had chosen to hold and to work, and to be honest about what was crumbling and what was worth saving, and to do the invisible work of maintenance that everyone would later call simply stability. Empires are not built by the people who take them. They are maintained by the people who refuse to let them fall. In the midnight hours when no one is watching, and there is no reward for the vigilance except the continued existence of the thing being watched. She had been that person for 9 years, largely unseen. largely unrewarded in the specific currency of acknowledgement that humans require to feel real. She was still that person, but she was no longer invisible to herself. That was the change, not the power, not the recognition, though the council had given her more of that in one morning than 9 years of quiet contribution had accumulated. The change was interior. The knowledge, settled and certain as stone, that she did not need to be seen to exist, that her work had value independent of whether it was credited, that a woman who knows what she is made of cannot be displaced by someone who only knows how to seem. The southern gate closed behind Varessa's escort. Seraphine turned from the window. The east study was full of light. The provincial records had been reorganized into the working system she was building for the ministerial restructuring. The map on the table had new lines on it, the secondary routes, the old northeastern trace, the connections she had used and would now formalize as part of Solmora's administrative infrastructure rather than leaving them as unmarked maintenance lines on old documents. She sat. She opened the cipher journal. She uncapped her pen. She wrote, "The Empire stands. The ground is shifting, and this time I know it is shifting because I am the one moving it. There is a difference between ground that shifts beneath you and ground that shifts because you have decided to rebuild it. I know the difference now in a way I did not know it a year ago." She paused. Then she wrote, "What I know about myself now, I cannot unknow. It would be easier in some ways if I could." Knowledge of your own capacity is its own kind of weight, because once you know what you are capable of, the choice not to use it is no longer available to you. You cannot pretend you didn't know. You cannot shelter in the smallness that was comfortable and say, "You were simply not built for more." I was built for more. I have always been built for more. She stopped writing. Outside the window, Solmora moved in its afternoon light. The city, the empire, the weight of it, and the beauty of it, and the cost of it. The twin wolves on the banners above the eastern gate, gold and black, facing opposite directions because a king who had not yet learned to trust his queen had once told her that ruling required watching every direction at once. She looked at the banners for a long time. Then she looked back at the page. She wrote the last line. "The crown remains heavy. Power remains merciless. But I am no longer carrying either one alone, and I am no longer pretending that carrying alone was strength. The most dangerous thing in any empire is not the enemy at the gate. It is the one inside the walls who has stopped being seen clearly. I was that person once. I will not be again. Not because someone finally chose to see me, but because I chose to see myself first. And that is the only choosing that cannot be taken away." She closed the journal. She locked it. She set her pen down. And Seraphine Vale, Queen of Solmora, woman who had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of a year that had tried in every possible way to reduce her to what she was not, sat in the east study in the afternoon light and breathed and was still and was whole. Not because the storm had passed, but because she had become, somewhere inside it, the kind of person that storms did not break, the kind that broke them instead.